for this meeting. With that, I will now call the meeting to order. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As always, we would like to welcome the public, the citizens to our meetings. We'll have a pretty good agenda tonight, so let's move on into any announcements, reminders, and I think we have some proclamations.
Yes, sir. Before we get to the proclamations, though, a couple of announcements. First, I want to thank all the staff that played a role in gearing us up for today's council meeting. As you can tell, there was a lot of work that went into the preparations, and so I want to thank staff from our Building and Equipment Services Department, IT Department, Communications Department, Derek Farrell, our ACM. He was spearheading the entire effort, and so I want to thank them for their work. Also know that as part of that effort, we are improving our accessibility through the continuance of a Facebook Live. And so today's council meeting will continue, or be the second meeting, I should say, that gets live streamed on Facebook. And so you'll notice that camera right there if you want to wave at it at some point. But thank you, staff, for all your work and dedication to this effort. I also want to briefly congratulate a few of you. Some of you may or may not be aware that exactly a year ago, two of you were elected and one of you was re-elected. And so I just want to congratulate Mayor McCoy, Councilmember Lofgren, Councilmember Young for the anniversary, if you will, of your election. And so congratulations. Thank you for your service to our community. I'm sure everybody's greatly appreciative of that. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Mayor, that is all I have on my end. We can
right,
proceed with the
And
proclamation.
I'd like to note in the audience tonight, we have a former Mayor, Will Armstrong. I'd like to welcome you tonight as well. Thank you. So I guess we can go into proclamations. Mr. Goosh?
Yes, sir. Mr. Mayor, there are three proclamations to be read tonight. The first is declaring National Economic Development Week, and this is signed today by Mayor Raleigh McCoy, and it reads in part, whereas Economic Development Week was created by the International Economic Development Council to increase awareness for local programs that create jobs, advance career development opportunities, and increase the quality of life everywhere. And whereas these partners include but are not limited to the City of Victoria, Victoria County, Victoria Regional Airport, the Port of Victoria, Victoria Economic Development Corporation, Victoria Sales Tax Development Corporation, the UHV Small Business Development Center, Victoria Chamber of Commerce, the Golden Crescent Regional Planning Commission, the Victoria Main Street Program, Victoria College, the University of Houston Victoria, Explore Victoria, and the Golden Crescent Workforce Solutions. Whereas these economic developers promote economic well-being and quality of life for their communities by creating, retaining, and expanding jobs that facilitate growth, enhance wealth, and provide a stable tax base. And whereas economic developers stimulate and incubate entrepreneurism in order to help establish the next generation of new businesses, which is the hallmark of the American economy. And whereas economic developers attract and retain high-quality jobs, develop vibrant communities, and improve the quality of life in their regions. Now, therefore, I, Raleigh McCoy, Mayor of the City of Victoria, do hereby proclaim May 4th through 9th, 2020 as National Economic Development Week and remind individuals of the importance of this community celebration, which supports expanding career opportunities and improving the quality of life. As I say, it is signed today by Mayor Raleigh McCoy.
Okay, if those are...
The second proclamation today is declaring Municipal Clerks Week. And it reads in part, whereas the office of the municipal clerk is a time-honored and vital part of the local government and exists throughout the world. And whereas the office of municipal clerk provides the professional link between the citizens, the local governing bodies, and the agencies of government at other levels. And whereas the municipal clerks continually strive to improve the administration of the affairs of the office of the municipal clerk through participation in education programs, seminars, workshops, and the annual meetings of their state, province, county, and international professional organizations. And whereas it is most appropriate that we recognize the accomplishments of the office of the municipal clerk, now therefore I, Raleigh McCoy, Mayor of the City of Victoria, do hereby proclaim the week of May 3rd through May 9th as Municipal Clerks Week, and further extend appreciation to all municipal clerks for the vital service they perform and their exemplary dedication to the communities they represent. The third proclamation is proclaiming Motorcycle Safety and Awareness Month. And it reads in part, whereas today's society is finding more citizens involved in motorcycling on the roads of our county, and whereas campaigns have helped inform riders and motorists alike on motorcycle safety issues to reduce motorcycle-related risks, injuries, and most of all fatalities through a comprehensive approach to motorcycle safety, and whereas it is important to urge all citizens of our community to become aware of the inherent danger involved in operating a motorcycle, and for riders and motorists alike to give each other mutual respect that they deserve. Now, therefore, I, Raleigh McCoy, Mayor of the City of Victoria, Texas, do hereby proclaim the month of May as Motorcycle Safety and Awareness Month in Victoria, Texas, and urge all residents to do their part to increase safety and awareness in our community. Thank you, Mayor. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Cush. Okay, we'll now move into any items from council?
I have an odd item, Mr. Mayor. I need some technical assistance with my computer. I've got the April 7th agenda pulled up on my computer. So I'll step away and...
Wait a moment till you...
I couldn't find it, and he found it. Thank you.
Any other items from council? Seeing none, we'll move into citizen communication. Now, we're doing this a little different. Some members here that filled out cards are in the room with us tonight. Others are in another space and will be asked to come in at the appropriate time. I think for clarity for all the discussions tonight, I would like to move the city manager's report on finance up to the first of the agenda so that we can learn things that might be germane to some following conversations. But having said that, anyone who's here tonight to speak to anything other than the work session, please step forward. I have here, I can't tell from the card, there's a Mr. Lopez. You have...
My name's, thank you, Mayor McCoy. My name is Desi Ben Lopez. I reside at 2002 and 1/2 Southwest Bend, Jordan, where I've been living for the past 7 years. My main reason here is Happy Cinco de Mayo, and it's National Mental Health Awareness Month. And I graduated from USC in 1994 in May. In June of 1994, 35 days later, I was diagnosed bipolar. You know, a lot of issues came up in life. I got my degree, though. That's one thing that nobody could ever take away from me. I'm an educated man, I sports consultant. I do a lot of work. But because I'm legally insane in 38 states, I can't work for a living. I have to live off my SSI and my SSTI. Last time I saw most of you guys was at Boot Fest. And I had a great time, but still that Harvey Wallbanger, it made me sick. And I had to go get help. I've been away for a few years. I miss opening the door for Mrs. Scott. I miss Josephine. I don't see Mr. Halapaskis no more. I definitely don't see my friend O.C. Garza, but I see him at church every Sunday. I've still been part of the community, but I've been real quiet lately. And then this epidemic hit, you know, and me and Anthony started collecting all the debris from Port Lavaca and Bloomington Highway, and we ended up getting a lot of, you know, aluminum and all kinds of debris, McDonald's stuff, because those truckers and everyone who goes down that street, they just throw their basura like if it's nothing. Well, I want to adopt that street. I've seen other people adopt streets and pick up the litter, and they get, you know, we just want to be part of the community again. I've been doing my work at the parks and the kitchen, and some people don't like the way I do things. I'm pretty blunt, I'm pretty rude, because I got to talk over 10 voices just to get one sentence out. So I've been practicing this for about 6 days to come up here and politely ask you guys. Everybody in their family has somebody who hurts. Everybody has somebody who needs to talk. Whether they're homeless, whether they're this, that, don't judge them. Help them. I still go to church every morning. And if I can't make it to church, I go to the Nazareth Convent and I just do the Stations of the Cross. Montecilla is still doing good. But she knows my dogs are tired and I need to see my Dr. Andrew or Dr. Caldwell and get my feet in order. But I do want to adopt that street. I've been doing this for 7 years and I've collected over 600 pounds of aluminum, little copper, all the wire, all the stuff. I don't know what to do with this, so I take it down to the waste management. They say, Mr. Lopez, what are you doing? I said, I'm just keeping myself busy. But now my mom has opened up many Casas tours. My grandfather's wife, J.R. Casas tours, no longer exists because in 2003 he passed away. I thought I was done. Now my mom wants to start many Casas tours. She's 70 years old. I'm only 50, but we want to do this till we're 100. And I want to live in Victoria till I'm 100. But it's a little city, and I'm used to L.A., I'm used to Hawaii, I'm used to tourist traps. This isn't a tourist trap for me. This is my home. And I'll do anything for any of you council members. You guys have seen me work. You've seen what I do. All I ask is continued acceptance. I go to Parkway. I go to Faith Family. But my main church is right here, St. Mary's. And a lot of people who see me out in the community, you're a cop, you're undercover, you're Hawaii 5-0, all the other. I said, no. I pray for the men in blue. I pray for the firefighters. I pray for everybody. But most of all, I pray for me and Montecilla. I lost Big Butter. But I just wanted to thank Victoria again for allowing me to be a presence here. Because that's what matters to most people. Not presence, your presence. Listening to them, hearing them. So I wanted to remind Victoria, it's National Mental Awareness. I've worked for NAMI, I worked for a lot of other companies, but I get tired and I walk away. I don't want to walk away from Victoria. This is my home. Please don't drive me away. Yes, I'll go home to Waikiki every once in a while because it's a lot prettier and a lot nicer. Pacific Breeze is better than the Gulf of Mexico. Maybe that's what created Corona, was the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know, but it's too hot. But I love Victoria, and I look forward to many more functions now that this is over. God bless you all, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez, and thank you for sharing your story. And you are a part of Victoria, and thank you very much. Anyone else to speak to any item other than the work session who would like to step forward? Then we'll move along. Pardon me?
Mayor, I think that they were wanting you to call their names out so they didn't all come to the podium.
Well, I'm going to call the names out for those at the work session right before the work session, so that it's fresh on the mind. And I'd like to have the city manager's reports on the finances, because I think that's important to know what finances we are, what we're looking at as part of a discussion. So were you going to give a report on your finances?
Mr. Mayor, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, we wanted to get some clarity behind the order of the items, and so we do have consent, and then we do have one item on the regular council meeting, and so I just want to make sure
But if we want to do those
understand.
first, we'll do that.
Up to you. We just wanted to make sure we understood what you meant
The
by
people that are
moving
here
our
to
item.
speak, I just want them to get through. So if that's the will of the council, then we'll go forward with the consent agenda.
There are 6 items on the consent agenda tonight that will be approved by a single vote. They are: first, the adoption of the minutes of the regular council meeting on April 21st, 2020. Second, the approval of modernization of the Victoria City Hall elevator by ThyssenKrupp using Omnia Partners Purchasing Cooperative Contract number R150801 for $142,333. The third is approval of the modernization of the Victoria Police Department elevator by ThyssenKrupp using the Omnia Partners Purchasing Cooperative Contract R150801 for $185,711. Fourth is the approval of the emergency purchase of an ambulance from Fraser Limited for $271,000 through Byboard Contract number 570-18. Fifth is the professional services agreement with Civil Corps LLC for Airline Road Waterline and Reconstruction Project between Laurent and Navarro in the amount of $184,000. And sixth is the award of the annual supply contract for limestone base to CEMEX Incorporated in the amount of $23.25 per ton for a total of approximately $186,000 based on an estimated annual quantity of 8,000 tons.
So moved.
A motion and a second for approval of the consent agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Everything passed. We
Item
move on to action item E1.
Item E1 is an amendment to the resolution continuing a state of local disaster.
Thank you. This is what I had asked last meeting to put onto the agenda. And I gave you some handouts, and I just took, I didn't put all of 418, the whole 93 pages on the dais for you tonight, but rather just wanted you to look at sections 014. First, that is the section in 418 that gives the power to the governor to declare a state of disaster. And in 418.014.c states a state of disaster may not continue for more than 30 days unless renewed by the governor. And following along those same lines, if you go 2 pages, you'll see section 418.108. This is the section that gives the power to the local officials for declaration of local disasters. And if you look at section B, it mirrors what is said in the governor's portion of 014, except 30 days is gone to 7 days for a local disaster. So it gives county judges and mayors the ability to issue a disaster declaration for a period of 7 days, upon which it has to be renewed by the local governing body. In this case, since we have both county and mayor in a joint EOC type of operation, county commissioners have to grant it, as does the city council. And if you look at the definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary for renew, it's to grant or obtain an extension of or on, right? To begin again, to repeat. Those are the typical definitions you're going to find when you look at what renew means. And so when we talk about emergency declarations, I don't know if y'all realize this or not, but the County of Victoria is still under a state authorized by the governor emergency declaration for Hurricane Harvey. And I didn't realize this until I started reading more into this. The governor has been renewing his initial declaration that he did in August of 2017 every 30 days for the over last 2.5 years. Because obviously his office recognizes that 418 requires him to renew every 30 days and not just once after the initial 30-day period and then let it go on forever until he removes it or the state elected officials, representatives, and senators remove it themselves. So therefore, following that same logic, right, we have a 7-day emergency disaster declaration. When we did that locally for Harvey, I think we got it right. We renewed every 7 days. And I'm not saying that's easy to do. It requires staff time, but that's what the law requires. We all have to come together and vote on it. The mayor has to come before us and say why he still needs a disaster declaration. And my feeling is the reason it's written this way is because of the immense powers that are given to the official, either locally or the governor, during a disaster declaration. They can come and commandeer vehicles. They can stop movements of people. But if you grant that power unlimited duration after that initial 7 days, what are we doing up here as elected officials? We represent the people. We are handing over all our freedoms and those of our constituents if we think that these disaster declarations have no ending. And so I ask you to consider amending the disaster declaration that we have. I believe the way I wrote it with Mr. Goosh is that we would pull it, or it's only valid until the next meeting. And I don't even think that we should have it right now. If you look at it, what orders do we really have in place? And I can ask Mr. Goosh, what orders do we have in place for the city under the emergency declaration? And then also, what orders are in place for the county?
There is one order in place for the city, executive order of the mayor, and none for the county. The executive order in place for the city is a forgiveness of all deadlines and fees that are set out in the city code, as well as forgiveness of library fine. I'm using the word forgiveness incorrectly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's a waiver of those things. And so it's a waiver of fees, fines, and deadlines is all that remains current. Yes.
And during Hurricane Harvey, we had something similar, but didn't we codify it with a date on it and some resolution?
I went back and looked at the disaster declarations for the Hurricane Harvey situation, and we had initially continued it for a period of 7 days, and then we had another continuation prepared for 7 days, but I believe we let it expire at that point because council determined that there was no further need for it.
Okay. But as far as fees and waiver or of those fees?
There were waivers of fees that were put in place by council that were done after the fact that were able to extend beyond.
So we could just do it as elected officials, put a resolution together with Mr. Goosh's help to do the same thing that this order is and make sure the power is restored back correctly and that we get back in line with every 7 days. Now, the memo that was prepared for this showed a list of, quite an extensive list of cities that are doing this. I think it's an overreach of government by each of those bodies. But what that memo didn't show was any counties or local municipalities that are doing 7 days. So you only saw one side of the story. I do know that Chambers County does it every 7 days. They've had almost every hurricane hit them over the past 10 or 12 years. So that's my presentation to y'all on it, and I'd love to hear what y'all had to say about it and y'all's thoughts on it, but I would like to get back to every 7 days, see if we still need an emergency disaster declaration.
Jeff, this wouldn't change the emergency order that we have placed in for the COVID since it already expired? This is just for something in the future?
Ours hasn't expired. That's an order, but our emergency disaster declaration, giving the county judge and the mayor all the powers listed in 418, right?
Ms. Solis, I may be able to clarify that. It's a common mistake that people make, and I've heard other people say the same thing, but there is a distinction between the disaster declaration that says that we are in a state of disaster and the executive orders that do things like order people to stay home. Those are two separate documents, and the executive order requiring people to stay home has expired, but the disaster declaration itself has not.
And Mr. Mayor, I'm not doing this because you've overstepped any bounds or anything, and I don't want you to think that or take it that way, or anybody out there in the public to take it that way. I just think it's our responsibility and the oath of office we took to uphold the laws. I see 418 as giving us 7 days to renew it and keep it on a 7-day rotation.
The one question I have, and I think it came up in meetings when both orders were done after the governor declared his, is some funding tied to these orders being in place?
Certainly, the FEMA funding that is in place requires there to be a disaster declaration. I am not certain whether that disaster declaration has to remain in effect for the duration of it. Yeah, that's what I suspected. Gilbert is saying he believes that it is the state disaster declaration that has to remain in effect. Mr. Mayor, would you like me to respond to any of these points?
We're here for a discussion. I always want to
I would like to
discuss
hear
everything.
from.
The only thing I can say is in the height of this thing, I was down there I've been there 2 months, almost on a daily basis, and there's a lot that goes on and stuff. And so you know, I'm not going to say it's inconvenient to stop and call a meeting, but it's just one more thing to do in the height of a situation. Perhaps in the future you could put it, I mean, but the way I read the declaration, that if any one of you decides that you don't like it, you have the authority to call in and have a meeting, as well as I do, to terminate the order.
I believe that in
Is that
our
the way
city
it's written?
charter, the mayor's the one that calls the meeting
Well,
or a special meeting, and that's what I'm saying. Keeping our liberties it may not be convenient. I'm not going to give up my liberties and following the law because it's inconvenient. I think it's maintaining a balance of power. And like I said, this has nothing to do with how this COVID-19 has gone, except for should have been renewing every 7 days. And I
Mr.
apologize
Mayor,
for
if
not
I may.
coming with
well, that's
earlier.
a legal opinion. I'll defer to the city.
If I may, let me start by saying it's always been my position that not to take sides between council members and not to argue with a council member. It's my position that I should advise council as a whole, and then council as a whole should make a decision. Nevertheless, when we're talking about legal matters such as this, I do think it's important that you hear my advice as well as see what's been written. And everything that I'm sharing today, with exception of one point, is something that Councilman Bucknight and I have already had extensive conversations about. We've been down this road before, so there's no surprise politics in any of this. There is one point that I'll bring up to address a point that he brought up tonight that I had not previously seen. 418-108 is different than 418-014 for the governor. This is the point that is different than what I have previously put in my memo and what he and I have previously discussed. If you look at 418-014 for the governor, it says a state of disaster may not continue for more than 30 days unless renewed by the governor. In 418-108, the phrase is slightly different. It says it may not be continued or renewed for a period of more than 7 days, except with the consent of the political subdivision. Continued or renewed versus renewed. There's a reason that the legislature chose to use different language there. I'm not certainly, in the minds of each legislator who adopted that, but when we're doing statutory interpretation, lawyers are charged to consider every word that is written as being meaningful. And so the fact that there is a distinction in the way that is worded matters. Councilman Bucknight and I have talked at length about the fact that this section 108 is in fact ambiguous. There is no doubt that it does not clearly state that the extension, the continuation of a local disaster, it doesn't say that it has to be for a period of 7 days or less. It doesn't say that it can be for a period of 7 days or more. It's ambiguous. It just says unless continued or renewed. And so the resolution that I wrote for you allows us to continue the state of disaster until it has been lifted by the mayor or city council. In my legal opinion, my professional legal opinion, that's a legal order. It would also be legal if you chose to shorten that to 7 days or less. Doing so, however, would require us to call a special council meeting every 7 days from here on out until that order gets lifted. And so if that's the will of council, staff stands ready to call those emergency meetings and set up the barriers and set up the chairs in the overflow area and whatever is necessary during this COVID response to call a special meeting. We will do that. But it is not necessary. Furthermore, I would say, if I were advising the governor and FEMA dollars were on the line, I would probably advise him to renew an order every 30 days because it's easier to convince FEMA that I've done it than it is to convince FEMA that I didn't need to in the first place. That is different than the advice that I would give council because, among other things, the governor can sign a new order with the stroke of a pen. Council cannot. We have to actually call a meeting and get staff together, get council back together in order to do that. And that's different between us and the governor. So my advice to you is different than it would be if I were advising the governor.
Thank you, Mr. Goosh. So you can see where we differ. Mine's a limit on governmental authority and keeps the power in the elected officials as opposed to a governmental body, or a government. I'm not saying anybody has done anything wrong during COVID-19.
I guess I also see in 418-108, though, that I'm seeing it that we as a body can make the declaration continue for more than 7 days without having another meeting, because I read it that it can't be continued for a period of more than 7 days, except here's how you can do it for a period of more than 7 days with the consent of the governing body. And so I don't see the need for every 7 days unless we make our declaration expire after 7 days. But I see this is giving me some leeway to not. And
I know it's giving leeway, but I don't find that to be the intent of this. And I read that except differently, because I'm seeing that the only way possible to renew it for another 7 days is by a vote of the local governing body. Just because the governor in the first section is the one that does the renewal, the only way to take it another 7 days, renew it, is by the local governing body.
well, except that it's not the way you read it or the way I read it. It's what was the legislative intent, and that's where I have to look to the city attorney.
And I might add, under the circumstances, we have a meeting every 2 weeks also, and people have asked to put things on the agenda, like you asked to put this on the agenda last time. And I would see that that would be a functioning thing that you could do at any time you felt it not necessary. So to me, I defer to the city attorney's opinion on it personally myself.
So it's a good question then. So what is the need for emergency declaration in the city and county right now?
We're still in the midst of this crisis. We haven't fully opened the government yet.
But that's handled by the governor's order.
Well, it all depends on if he changes his orders very early in the game. As we went through this process and some of the orders that the judge and I issued, there was some leeway within those orders where we mandated some things that the governor didn't. We actually allowed all businesses to be determined essential because he did not preclude us. In one of his orders, he said we could not take away from the list of essential businesses, but it didn't say we couldn't add. So we chose to do that, and we also put limitations on it. If you opened your business, we felt as though you could require a business employees to wear a mask, just like we require people to wear hairnets for health reasons. But we didn't go so far as to mandate the public do it because there's a constitutional issue over that. So in many ways, I think for a period of 3 days, we had a much more understandable type of arrangement, and that's what we did. So we don't know when he issues his next orders what he may choose to do or not do, and then we would have to come back and declare. Well, I guess first we would have to vacate the order that's in place now, and then I would have to declare another emergency.
Right. And
So it's just a matter of, do we want to go through all of that back and forth when we're still in a process that we're not out of an emergency right now?
Well, the only one order that we have should be handled by resolution and discussed and voted upon by the members of this body. If that passes, then there's no reason for the emergency declaration. It doesn't stop the mayor and the county judge from issuing another one. And you got 7 days, and it rolls on 7 days renewals. But to me, it's just a governmental overreach item that I felt it necessary to bring before y'all. And I mean, y'all may not agree with me, and that's fine. There's plenty of things that I've brought up here that y'all haven't agreed with me either, so it's okay.
Well, that's what.
But I felt strongly about it, and so.
And let me tell you, it's a very humbling thing because don't kid yourself. I agonize all the time because I have beliefs similar to yours in many ways.
Yes.
And it's a very thought-provoking process that I've gone through personally before I've chosen to do some of these things. And so it's not something that I take lightly, and it's something that I've taken very seriously throughout this. And we've had serious discussions with it, with the judge and I and everything. So I just want to tell you the process that we go through.
And that's why I said it has nothing to do with the way y'all have handled everything and the way y'all have made y'all's decisions. And I appreciate everything y'all have done. I just don't want to set a precedent for our city and county.
Well, at this point, I feel like continuity is really important. And so I'd kind of like to know what, if anything, we need to do to make it clear that this is our status right now will continue being under the governor's order and being under the local city order. And I'm not sure whether that means to vote for this resolution or not, whether we should amend it and make it be that we're extending it for a period of something until our next council meeting or our council meeting after that. But I feel like continuity is important, and to say that it's expired and then ask the mayor to be ready to jump on a new declaration at a moment's notice, I think that's asking too much of him that's not necessary.
It's pretty funny. I didn't, as I read this, it is ambiguous. The except, I looked at it at one way, that this was kind of just to open it up and it's except for the 7 days and it can go longer. But then you brought up your point and I see how you read it. It's,
I think the legislature needs to do a little work on this next session.
it is ambiguous.
But that's why, in what I asked Mr. Goose to prepare, I said, let's just put this one line item in there that the local state of disaster declared by Mayor Raleigh McCoy on March 16th, 2020 is hereby continued for the city of Victoria pursuant to 418-108B Texas Government Code through May 12th, 2020, unless repealed by the mayor prior to May 12th, 2020.
But that's not a council meeting time, so he'd have to declare a new.
If needed. Right, that's a week's time away.
And the only other thing I'll add to it is, for what it's worth, we've worked very hard to speak with kind of one voice between the county and the city on this matter, because I think it's very important. Other communities have not done that, and it's caused severe problems within the community. So, if we did that, we would be out of sync with the county's order, which, of course, is their problem. But I'm just pointing that out, that we've worked very hard to speak to our community as a single voice to the extent we can. And that's been a very important thing for me, because I never wanted any dissension and confuse our citizens any more than this particular situation has done. We've never dealt with anything like this. I think it's very unique. Many of the things that even CISA was written about had to do with natural disasters.
Yeah,
so I think there's a lot to discuss with the legislature as it comes up in how do we deal and amend things that this pandemic has brought, because it is a different animal entirely.
Yes.
So
yeah, 418 had no mention whatsoever of pandemic.
CISA had
no
issue of that. And so there's differences. The only thing that I would speak to is, again, continuity of our local governments trying to deal with this situation.
Well, there's no further discussion.
I'd like to say something.
Sure.
I see your point, and it is ambiguous. And since it is ambiguous, 50 cities believe, as the city attorney does, that it's okay to continue with the way it is. I don't see any reason to change it. The language shouldn't be ambiguous, but we're not the state legislature. I would just like to, I'm not for this. I understand your point.
Mm-hmm.
I do. But I would just like to continue with the way it is.
Okay. Well, I make a motion to approve item E1.
Second.
We have a motion and a second on item E1. Is there any further discussion on the matter?
Thank you all for letting me bring this before you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we vote for it, we're going to
Yeah.
change it, or we're not going to
No,
change it?
it's a motion to approve
The change.
the change that Mr. Balknight.
So a yes vote is to change it to expire on May 12th, and to vote against it is just leave it like it is.
And the staff recommendation is in the report, is denial.
Okay, so there's been a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none,
Can we have a roll call vote, please?
if you want one, I don't think it's necessary.
I want one.
All right. We'll begin with you.
No.
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 No?
Aye.
Aye.
2 ayes, 5 noes. Thank you. And let's take it up with the
Yes,
legislature.
I'm working on those edits already and suggestions.
With 2 or 3 other items that
Yeah.
we'll be talking a little about. Yeah.
And
I don't
Mayor,
think-
I'd also like to thank Councilman Balknight for a stimulating discussion over the last couple of weeks. We've had some great conversations on the phone. I think we each see where each other's coming from. And I always welcome those kind of conversations from any of you who have questions about matters.
It's good, makes you think.
Well, we've had a lot of constitutional controversies.
I don't think
Too much, I can
legislature
assure
was
you.
counting
All right,
on
well, moving
COVID-19 when they wrote this, okay? So,
All right, moving forward, now we're through with the 2, so I'd like the financial reports that are germane to our upcoming discussion.
All right. Good evening, Mayor and Council. So for background, this financial update really began because of what we're going through with COVID-19. You may recall that the very first COVID financial-related update that staff provided was at our first meeting in April. And at the time, we shared with you some very preliminary information. Of course, a lot has changed in the last month, and so I'm going to walk through some of those changes. But just to highlight some of the feedback that we received at that meeting, some of the feedback, for instance, from Councilmember Lofgren was a desire for us to be more conservative. And so we've done that, and so I'll walk through that. At the end of the day, when we were debriefing with staff, we realized that we're not magicians. We're not, we don't predict. This is something that is unprecedented. We can do the best we can to estimate what we think the impact is going to be. And so all the credit to Wesley and Gilbert to suggest taking a different approach to the financial update and viewing it from the lens of our working capital or our fund balance, and rather try and paint the picture to you about how worse would things need to actually get before we should sort of start worrying about our finances. At that same meeting, we also shared some strategies with you about some projects and other expense controlling mechanisms that we implemented to try and create a working capital going into our fiscal year 21 budget. And that'll become clear as I go through the which gives us a reimbursement of 75%, and us responsible for 25%. This summarizes the assumption changes that are included in today's presentation. As at the presentation last month, we shared with you that our projection was showing a 14% decrease in sales tax revenue through the rest of the fiscal year and even halfway into next fiscal year. We've updated those to reflect 20%. I will also note that last month's presentation included March being 14%. And this week, we'll get final confirmation on what that number will be. But the state controller's office late last week released what that impact was statewide for March. And that decrease statewide was about 9.5%. And so if we simply take that same 9.5% and apply it to the impact for us, it would obviously be smaller than the 14% that we estimated at this time last month. So that's positive news for us. And so hopefully the official number that comes in, I think tomorrow, will confirm that, and then we'll update accordingly. We also talked about the hotel motel tax, and that, of course, is one of the funds that is the most impacted because, of course, nobody's traveling. People aren't staying in hotels. At that presentation last month, we broke it down by quarters, and we suggested that we foresaw seeing a decrease of 60% for the third quarter and a 50% decrease for the fourth quarter. And as you can see, we've increased those assumptions to 80 and 75% respectively. I'm going to hit the big funds, and then at the very end, I'm going to hit on health insurance fund to recap the presentation that Gilbert gave at that same council meeting. And then I'm going to hit on also updated projections for VSTDC, since obviously VSTDC is also impacted by that change from 14 to 20%. Really briefly on general fund, you're going to see as I go through each of these funds a very similar bar graph, and so I want to kind of explain it to you. The beginning fund balance is representative of budgeted versus projected. Now, if you're asking yourself, well, how can you project something different at the beginning fund balance, is because really projected in that line item means audited. And as a matter of fact, we'll have that financial report later tonight. And so going into our current fiscal year's budget, so summer of last year when we approved the budget, that budget assumed or incorporated about an $18 million working fund balance, and the audited number came back at 19.3, so it came back better. You'll see where our revenues hit and our expenditures hit, and the difference between budgeted and projected. And you'll see, and we'll run through what those are made up of so that you can see what that picture looks like. Recall that on the expenditure side, we've put a lot of projects on hold. And so that's part of the reason why in a lot of these presentations, you'll see the projected ending fund balance actually greater than budgeted, because by us intentionally delaying projects, we're naturally going to keep that money, and thus consequently that projected ending fund balance is going to be higher, which is what we want. We want a healthy beginning fund balance going into next year's budget.
Mr. Carter?
Yes, sir.
May I ask, just to refresh our memories, what is our stated 25% general fund balance?
So it's about...
What would that number be?
So it's actually coming up on a slide.
Okay.
And so if you can let me get to that.
That was quick.
Okay.
That was quick.
No, he's good. He's good. And so again, this is just very specific on some of those changes. You'll notice, of course, the big decrease on the municipal court. On the general fund side is sales tax, followed by municipal court. Of course, sales tax is the one that we've been talking about. And so that $967,000 is already taken into account the difference between 14 to 20%. And municipal court, of course, is also projected to come lower since they've shuttered their operations and are beginning to slowly but surely ramp up. On the bottom side, where you see some of the differences on the expenditure side, you'll notice the big numbers related to transfers and capital outlay, and those are all related to items, projects, one-time projects that we pushed out. And I'm not going to run through those, as those were part of that presentation last time, but I'm happy to provide that information later to you if you like. But as an example, that included projects related to the North Heights. We talked about moving North Heights from this fiscal year to next. So that project alone, for instance, was about $1 million, as an example.
Could you explain that personnel
Sure.
decrease
So
in $9 million, but you showed the COVID-19 personnel impacts is over $500,000?
So this has nothing to do with COVID. So COVID tracking is separate. We set up a separate COVID account that tracks those expenditures. That
$500,000, would that be above and beyond what normal payroll was?
No. In some cases, yes. And so in some cases, yes, and in some cases, there's a specific amount that accumulates over time. And so FEMA is very particular about when you can quantify overtime versus not. And so we need to just continue our ongoing processes as it relates to overtime. But there is a very specific breakdown on that $500,000 on what's overtime and what's not. Gilbert, I don't know if you have that number. But
It's not the specifics of it. It's just, it seemed funny to me that we're saying COVID-19 caused over $500,000.
there is overlap, though, if that's
personnel, but yet we're having almost $1 million of decrease in expenditures.
Well, and
related
that's mainly because we have vacancies, right? And so the explanation for that 901,000 is that we have vacancies throughout the year. And so we, of course, when we budget, we assume as if we're going to have, all of our over 600 positions full 365 days out of the year, but we know that that's not the case. And so every year we do have some level of savings on the personnel related items because of vacancies. And that's what that 900 is representative of.
Okay.
This shows your 25%. And so here, if we go back to this slide, you'll see that with all of the changes that we just discussed, the decrease in revenues, the shifting of expenditures to create a higher ending fund balance, which on this bar graph, you see it at 17.1 million. That 17.1 million is reflective on the bar graph on the left. The bar graphs on the right are representative of what that 25% is. And so the yellow is representative of if we simply just took our general fund budget, including recurring and one-time expenditures, what is that 25%? And that's close to 13 million. If we simply said, let's just look at our recurring expenditures, that's the green, that's close to 12.5. And so this exercise here is intended to showcase where we are and what are the potential impacts. And so currently, for example, we're projecting that we're going to get slightly less than $1 million in sales tax. So for easy math or for easy numbers, let's just say it's $1 million in decrease that we're projecting in sales tax revenue. And that is representative of the pair of bar graphs on the left. That is representative of the total of sorry, I'm blanking out on the 6% versus the 10.7%, Gilbert.
6% is on the budget, the 10% is based upon the 19 year.
Got it. But in order to really understand that number, we need to understand that we projected or budgeted very conservatively this year. Regardless, though, what you see as you continue is what if we see an additional $2 million decrease on our sales tax, meaning close to a $3 million? Or what if we see an additional $4 million decrease in sales tax? What would that look like? And the lines that go across is representative of where that 25% is. And so this is intended to show you, for example, that if we see an additional decrease of $2 million in sales tax, which is that purple bar graph, it's still above our required 25%. So this is simply to give you an idea of where we are and those impacts. The remaining to hit target is simply to communicate how much money we would need to receive for the rest of the fiscal year in order to hit that target. We think this is very conservative, but of course, at the end of the day, we don't really know. But again, this is simply to showcase how bad it would have to be before we start hitting that 25% reserve. And of course, this is only specific to sales tax. I know it's a lot on one slide.
I know a graph is supposed to make it clear. So I'm just trying to get the big picture, because when you first talked about the tallest bar on the left side, you said something about $1 million, and I've been looking and looking for the million. So is this graph showing me that that first group of 2 bars is collections of around 17 million? The next one, the next group of 2 is at 15 million. You're just showing me what happens if we have a loss of 2 million and then another group.
I am showing what happens if we have the losses, but the taller bar graphs is our working capital.
Okay.
It's not representative of how much money we get in sales tax alone.
So our working capital, and so
or the general fund. And so again,
so if there's a loss of income, that's the impact that this is now the working capital that we have to use.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so we could have put a bar graph in there. If we are assuming a 20%, we could have had one at 20%. You have 18.3, so that's close.
You could.
Yeah. I'm just
Yeah.
based upon the assumption that.
Right.
Yeah, so we're a little bit more, that's what I was going to say, we're a little bit more than 2 million decrease is what we're projecting right now. Slightly,
We can handle
current-
a 4 million decrease
from 2019. Right.
and
Potentially.
still stay at our reserve.
Actual 5 million, because that 4 is on top of the other mill that
Okay.
Mr. Garza is talking about.
Okay.
Because remember, we're already accounting for 1 million
Okay.
in decrease, and so all of these are in addition to that.
Excuse me?
And the 1
So this
million-
already, the one on the left, which projects the 17.1 million, already is taken into account a decrease in about $1 million in sales tax revenue. So the one on the right simply says if we see,
But that's what we budgeted from 2019, right?
we didn't budget a decrease in
Sales tax revenue?
we did, but what we're simply looking at now is comparing what we have budgeted for fiscal year 20 with what we're anticipating happening the rest of this fiscal year. And what we're anticipating happening the rest of this fiscal year is that we see in totality a decrease of close to $1 million in sales tax revenue difference between what we budgeted versus what we expect. The other percentage is the actual, which is what Gilbert was referring to, that because we budgeted conservatively, going into the budget, that's why the percentage isn't as high as you might see in other communities or maybe even to your own liking, but because we budgeted very conservatively. It might make more sense as we kind of go through some of these, because it's the same exercise, and we can always go back to the sales tax one. But the gist of this, or the point of this, is simply just to stress, no pun intended, that for us to sort of come close to our 25% required reserve, that we would have to see a pretty significant decrease in sales tax revenue. Now, even though we're required to have the 25%, we obviously don't want to flirt with that 25%, and that's why we intentionally want to push out projects so that going into next fiscal year's budget, we start off at the 17 versus starting off at 15, 14, 13, because we know that the 25% is, depending on how you look at it, around $12 million. And we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if a hurricane's going to come. We don't know so many factors. And so we don't want to, I'll knock on wood on that one, right? But, we don't want to flirt with that 25%. Same thing with Motel Tax Fund. I'll run through this quickly. This is actually a very healthy fund, obviously smaller in numbers. But again, you'll see that the fund balance at the end of the shifting of the projects that we went through a month ago is projected to end at 1.38. And so this is kind of summarizes. You'll recall that some of the projects that we pushed out, which is under capital, refer to some of the projects with Riverside Stadium and at the community center. There were a few one-time projects that we communicated a month ago that we were just going to delay those. On the Motel tax revenues, that number that's close to $900,000 is also reflective of the new 80% potential decrease on that. The good news, though, is that on the working fund balance, that 25% is very small. Most of our dollars through the hotel occupancy tax are spent on one-time projects. And so simply taking a 3-month reserve and just looking at that expense is just shy of $300,000, and you could see that our projected fund balance is way above $1 million. And so worst case scenario for the hotel occupancy tax fund, we just won't do one-time capital projects as we've done in the past. And we need to revisit this outside agencies program. This slide was simply put in there just to kind of show you that we haven't forgotten about it, and that it's important that you know that a lot of these events are obviously impacted by what's going on now. And so we expect to have a savings in this fund. And Derek is spearheading, our ACM is spearheading a game plan to present to you shortly as part of the budget presentation on how to proceed with those funds. But currently, for instance, we're anticipating a decrease of close to $50,000, or savings, I should say, of $50,000 from the original $135,000 that was allocated last year for all of the outside agencies. And again, this is simply to showcase, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's very evident that the working fund capital fund balance for the motel tax fund is in good shape. Water, wastewater, utility fund. You all know that our enterprise funds are our strongest funds. I'm sure the auditor will repeat that statement. And so you'll see here, we did shift some projects around, and so you will see that the audited beginning working capital came in at 10.29, and we're projected to end at 11.03. And so we're projected to be better going into next year. This simply just summarizes some of those decreases. Some of this has to do with COVID. Some of it doesn't have anything to do with COVID. We haven't hit summer, and so typically summer is when we get a better sense of where realistically we are with these items. You may also recall that, I don't know exactly when it hit, but there were some rate increases that went into effect and have slowly but surely gone into effect. And so those have helped. Going back to Gilbert's perspective on budgeting conservatively, there were some rates that went into effect, but we didn't budget accordingly because we weren't quite sure how that would impact. But when we get into presenting this specific fund during the summer, you'll get a better feel for where we are with revenues. But long story short, we're in good shape. Capital, you'll notice the $1.3 million at the bottom. Again, we decided out of an abundance of caution to push out some projects so that we are in as best shape going into next year as possible. As an example, out of that 1.3, you'll recall that we pushed out one of the utility projects that we'll talk about, I think, during CIP as well. So more info on that project then. This one, pretty straightforward if you're kind of getting the gist of this. And so we'll be projecting ending up at $11 million for projected working capital. And the 3-month is 6.5 if you look at it including one-time expenditures, or if you're looking at recurring only, it's 6.2. And so there again, you'll see that we're in pretty good shape. This is intended simply to represent the same exercise. But again, I'm not going to spend much time on that because clearly our fund balance is in good shape there as well. Solid Waste Fund, Enterprise Fund, it's also in good shape. You'll notice here that the audited beginning working capital came in at 9.1 and it's estimated to be at 9.5. This kind of just goes through some of the variances that we've updated. Again, some of these have to do with COVID, some of them not. This specifically, as we mentioned a month ago, as businesses aren't operating, we're beginning to see some impact on that through the franchise. But we are seeing an increase of volume at the landfill, which is good news. A lot of people are taking out their junk, which we appreciate. But this fund's pretty straightforward. And this one shows how the fund balance looks in this particular fund. And so you'll see that the projected working capital going into fiscal year 21 is estimated to be 9.5. And the 3 months or 25% fully loaded, including one time, is 1.3. And recurring only is a little over 1 million. And so you'll see that this fund's in pretty good shape going into next year. So I won't spend much time there. I know at the last month there was some questions about Riverside Golf Course, and so I wanted to show you some information related there. Of course, this is a very small fund, but I wanted to at least show you where we stand. Golf course was actually doing really well before COVID hit, and so you might look at these numbers and say, well, I think that hit's going to be larger, but that was because it came in ahead of what was budgeted for the first half of the year. So for instance, even with it being shut down, you'll notice that the working capital is actually going into fiscal year 21 is going to be greater than what it was audited at the end of last fiscal year. So it's going from 320 to 327. And so these are some very minor changes there. And so with this being a very small fund, right, this is kind of where we look at this. Some of these smaller funds don't necessarily have the requirement of 25% the way that some of our larger funds do. But obviously, out of best practice, we want to make sure that we at least are cognizant of that 25%. And so that's why we still went through this exercise with this fund. Any questions on the golf course?
Plug for the golf course. It's open?
Yes, sir.
Good. For the public?
Yes, sir. Community Center Fund, I didn't show any information on Community Center or a month ago, I should say. This, of course, is taking somewhat of probably a larger hit than some of the other funds. Recall that the Community Center Fund receives some funds from the Motel tax to operate, and we also delayed some projects, and they've also been shut down. And so they continue to be shut down. We don't anticipate the community center opening back up, tentatively scheduled until June. We'll revisit that here in the next few weeks. Hopefully things are trending appropriately so that we can continue allowing some of these large gatherings to take place in our facilities. These are just reflective of some of that. And so, for example, there you'll see the decrease in rental fees that we're anticipating that go above 100,000. Now, this is just estimated. We have no idea how it's going to end up. I think if we actually take the actuals for, I think the last month and a half, I think it was only close to 30,000. I think 29,000 was a number that I saw earlier today. And so this is simply taking into account the fact that people are going to be hesitant to have these gatherings for the rest of the fiscal year. And so we need to be thinking that even though we might reopen in June, not everybody's going to continue to have their quinceañera or their wedding or whatever it is. So we need to be cognizant of that. And you'll notice the savings there of $172,000 on the capital side, which are reflective of the projects that we went through last month. And this one, however, its working capital is in good shape compared to a 25%. But again, it's a small fund, and so these aren't large numbers, but at least it's to give you a sense that if we were to apply that same lens of 25% even to our smallest of funds, the working capital is significantly above that. Part of the reason why we went through all these funds is because these are the funds that have personnel. And so at the end of the day, we want to prioritize our employees. And so this is a summary recap of what was budgeted versus projected and some of that variance. And so again, on the general fund, that 1.2, that included the $900,000 for sales tax, as well as some smaller amounts. There was the municipal court revenue decrease that was in there. And so you'll notice those as we go through. The Motel tax fund, that $900,000 is reflective of our updated projections on how the third and fourth quarters will come in. And you'll see the smaller funds in those projections as well. And then on the expenditure side, you'll see those figures that all add up. And happy to send you specifics on all of that as you wish, but we wanted to provide you a snapshot of everything together. Happy to take any questions on any of that. I know it was a lot of information, but we wanted to try a different approach on talking about financial impact, just to give you hopefully a sense of reassurance that at least in some of these funds, our working capital balance is in good shape. Know that as we're preparing to distribute a preliminary budget to you next month, we are taking into account some of that working capital. And so don't be surprised if during the budget presentations there is slight conversations about potentially leveraging some of the working capital for one-time expenditures. We do that every year. That's how we save up money for big projects and do other things. And so that's something that we're very conscious of, but know that we're not trying to get anywhere near 25%. I mean, it's very, very minimal what we're talking about. And we'll get more into that during the summer.
Mr. Garza?
Yes, sir.
The $5.5 million overrun on projected expenses for other funds, what would that be? Is that textile?
You mean what qualifies as other funds?
No, why are we $5.5 million over budget on those expenditures projected to be?
You want to hit that one?
Sure, I will.
Go for it.
Thank you. Basically, Mr. Bugnight, all that is really related to the construction funds. Our construction fund are technically drawdowns. You don't have money coming in, you're just drawing down money that was there. So that is the drawdown on all these projects that have been happening in the construction funds, streets, utilities, and everything like that. That's the main effect right there. Okay. So those are planned drawdowns. So if you take out all the construction side, you have a different picture. But that's the whole budget right there.
All right.
And I'm sure some of those big projects will be talked about when we hit to the CIP. I'm going to move on to a different topic, if that's all right. Related, but slightly different. At that same meeting a month ago, Gilbert went through some health plan highlights, and I want to provide some high-level summary of that. I know that during the conversation on the Small Business Assistance Program, a couple of you brought up the situation with our health fund, and so I want to make sure that we re-provide the information. Whether it's good or bad, it's irrelevant. It is what it is, right? We just want to make sure that we put it fresh in front of you. You may recall that during Gilbert's presentation, really we talked a little bit about the history. And I think this slide really tells the whole story of our health fund. The red line is representative of the ending balance, right? The fund balance, the working capital. And we just got done, going through through bar graphs and slides about working capital and the importance of keeping that working capital high and healthy. And so you'll notice that with the health fund, it's actually gone the opposite direction. It's gone down. And that's because we haven't adequately budgeted, quite frankly, for the expenditures. And so you'll notice that on the expenditures, sure, they hover around $5 million and they go between 5 and 6. And we could talk about how the increase to the cost of healthcare is one of the factors or the sole factor on the situation of our health fund. And while, yes, it plays a factor, it's not the only factor, right? Historically, the approach to creating a healthy fund balance for us or for covering the expenditures of our health insurance claims has been to, whenever we come across funds or free up some funds, is we'll sort of, after the fact, send money to the health insurance fund, right? We've done that the last 2 fiscal years. This fiscal year, we did it with $1 million from the Textile Overpass funds, where we said, you know what, that working capital is getting too low. Boom, we're going to inject $1 million in there. The year prior to that, Gilbert was able to find some savings through personnel savings and other things, and said, you know, we need to inject $1 million in there. But at that point, you're always behind the curveball, right? And so what we suggested that we would try and do moving forward is, rather than trying to find the money afterwards, is saying we need to just budget the way you're supposed to budget from the beginning. And so we showed what that would take. And so we, of course, talked a little bit about, or Gilbert talked a little bit about Lockton and some of the work that they've done, and in essence showed that, for instance, for this year, we're estimated to be $1.5 million difference between the claim cost and the funding rates, right? In a traditional sort of, the way this is supposed to work is all the money that comes in from the employer and the employee and the premium cost at the end of the year, that total should total the expense on the claim side. And the reality is that for us, it hasn't, and it hasn't for a while. And so we need to try and have that hard conversation about how can we just budget it the way that it's supposed to be from the get-go. And so for this specific fiscal year, we're probably okay. And so you'll notice there that $1 million that I referenced, which came from the Textile Overpass funds, that'll help make up some of that difference. You'll see some of that funding rate difference that Gilbert talked about that'll create some capacity. And so that $5,000 there at the bottom, you know, it's not ideal, but it's black, right? The number is black, and so we'll take it. The challenge is going to be going into next fiscal year. If nothing changes, which of course things always change, but if nothing changes, where are we going to get that $1.5 million from? And so historically, the approach that the city has taken has been, well, we just under budget, and then later, if we come across the money, we'll send it over to the health fund. What we want to say is, let's find a way to budget that additional $1.5 million as part of the budget and not simply try and find that money later. And so what we proposed doing, or discussed verbally, was doing that. And the way that we've discussed internally doing that is, and Gilbert alluded to it last month, was splitting that up over 2 fiscal years, right? Obviously, $1.5 million is too much of a difference, or even $1 million is too much of a difference to come up with all at once. And so going into next year's fiscal year budget, don't be surprised that the fiscal year 21 budget takes half of that difference and puts half of it under recurring and half of it under one time, so that we can slowly but surely start transitioning to fully funding our health insurance fund on the recurring side and not solely relying on one time. That's, of course, taking into account nothing happens, right? Know that we are currently actually going through Lockton, going through an RFP process to bring a competitive process to our health insurance benefits. And so we'll know more on that here in the summer. But we're hopeful that through that process, we're able to get a better product that hopefully brings down some of those expenditures, so that hopefully our strategy over the next 2 or 3 years is not solely just us slowly but surely increasing our recurring, but that hopefully through a new potential TPA, we can decrease some of those expenditures and find a meet in the middle. But Gilbert and I, our administration, we want to get away from trying to just find money in the future to fund it. We want to try and find ways to fund it proactively the way that it should be from the get-go. And so that's what we plan on doing. This slide simply just shows how much of that is within all the different funds. So obviously the general fund is the greatest one. So you see that at the very right, that if we simply take that close to $1 million difference, that about $740,000 comes from the general fund, and you'll see some others there. That's it for the health fund. Any questions on the health fund? I just wanted to make sure I reiterated that discussion. Okay. We already talked about that. Really quickly on VSTDC, we made the adjustments to also go from the 14 to 20%. Very similar to on the general fund side, we're anticipating an impact or a decrease for the rest of this fiscal year and even leading into next fiscal year. And so that's what you see shaded and in red. Recall that we pushed out a lot of projects. And so many of the projects that we pushed out were originally funded out of Sales Tax Development Corporation. For instance, even one of the projects that was initiated today during consent for airline came from us delaying a project, which was Vine Street, which actually gave us a savings. You may recall that. And so we also pushed out a few other projects that they'll go through as part of the CIP. But the big thing to take away from this is that in our exercise of doing that, some of which was intentional and some of which was COVID related, is that our projected fund balance for VSTDC is actually projected to jump from 5.1 to 10.1 because of delaying these projects. And so you'll hear as part of the CIP conversation that our recommendation will be to focus our attention on finishing the projects that have already been approved and then coming back later and discussing new projects as opposed to just putting a lot on our plate, quite frankly. But they'll get into the weeds of that. But this is why we're continuing to have conversations about utilizing Sales Tax Development Corporation for projects. We want to make sure that whatever momentum has been gained from us having a more engaged VSTDC, whether it's through partnerships with the airport that the president has brought up, or whether it's the proposal on the Small Business Assistance Program that was brought up, and the backfill that VSTDC might do or can do for Parks Project through the general fund, or other projects that we've discussed in executive session that might be coming up in the near future, or projects that the VDC might be working on that they will bring forward. We want to make sure that from a funding position, we can have those conversations. And that if there isn't appetite to pursue these projects, it's not because of funding, it's because of other reasons. And so I want to make that clear with showing this difference there. In terms of the project big picture, we don't anticipate much delay. Typically, the CIP discussion takes place in May, so that'll happen today. Typically, the preliminary budget gets distributed to you in June. We're shooting to hopefully get that to you slightly earlier in June that you have received in the past. Quite frankly, all this COVID stuff has impacted our original timeline as well, because it won't be until the beginning of June that we'll actually know exactly how April did with sales tax. And April is going to be the big telling month that tells us what to do with the rest of the fiscal year. And so we're going to be pushing it to distribute a preliminary budget to you by mid-June, but that's still our goal. And it's still our goal to have the budget work sessions at the end of June as originally scheduled so that we can have that conversation. And then, as you know, we typically go through the official public hearings in August and go through the formal adoption in September. That's it.
Thank you.
Any questions overall? Thank you.
That was very informative.
Oh, you have,
I do have a question. Just, I know a lot of this focused on the rest of this year. What's sales tax projected to look like? I know we showed it for Sales Tax Development Corporation, but for the city, are we down? We're down again, right? Another $1 million from 2019 or from 2020, which would be about $3 million from 2019's budget.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, I don't know if that's exactly the figure, but you're right. We are estimating a decrease in sales tax revenue for fiscal year 21. Happy to share with you an updated table similar to the one that I have up here that shows the impact that we're projecting extending through half of next fiscal year. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The revenue for sales tax revenue for fiscal year 21 will be budgeted to be less. And so it will necessitate us having very creative conversations about how to continue doing what we're doing, operationally speaking. And so I look forward to that conversation. But, you know, we got to do what we got to do, right? I mean, we got to take advantage of having a healthy working capital. We need to take advantage of having, you know, VSTC, take advantage of having a healthy hotel occupancy tax and taking leveraging that, right? We should feel very fortunate that we are not in the position of many cities across the state or country that are furloughing employees, letting go of employees. We're continuing to hire because I want to make sure that we're continuing to do what we set out to do a year ago. Right? This month's my 1-year anniversary too. And so I want to make sure that we push through this COVID situation and don't let it hinder us from our overarching goals that we have. And so we're working on a proposed budget that will probably be one of the most creative budgets that you probably will have seen, but it'll keep us going, and it's going to keep us continuing to push towards improvement. And there'll be sacrifices made. Obviously, one-time projects are going to have to be less than years past, but we'll get to that in the summer. So,
I have a terminology question. I think you put up the wastewater. My question is, I've got a handout for another part of the meeting that talks about the utility fund. Is the utility fund the wastewater fund, or those different funds? Same fund with different names?
Same.
Okay.
Yeah. Technically, we call it the Water Wastewater Utility Fund.
Okay.
But sometimes you might hear us talk water fund, wastewater fund, utility fund. We should probably do better of using the same, or we should just get rid of water, wastewater and just call it utility fund. But anyway.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garza. Okay, with that, I think we'll move on into the agenda to, I want to move into the work session part of the agenda, because we have people here that are here to speak to that. I've got some cards here. The one person that's waiting in the wings is Miss Vella. I think she's in another spot.
She's here now.
Here now? Okay. And then Mrs. Yanka, is that? Yes, sir. She here to speak to this item? Okay. Well, let's just start with you then, and we'll go through the cards. Ms. Yanka?
I feel like the masked bandit, so I'm Patty Yansha. I am a small business owner, in technical terms, a tiny business owner. I am 100% women are women-run. There are two of us that have both retired. I'm from public school system. My partner from working at the coal plant. So we both have been educated people and wanted to do something for Victoria because we were bored. We started our business 4 years ago called Sweet Occasions. It's a local candy store. We did this to try to do what we do, mums, flowers for the football season, which we'll see what that brings. But we do weddings, all that sort of thing, which has affected us with the COVID, of course. So we have become very creative in things in the past couple of days of just getting our business back in order. I am asking for the city to really look at helping the small businesses because we do pay sales tax. That's a big part of what I'm seeing as part of the budget. I want to get my business and grow it. My point is that we started this business without having to get any funding. We did that on our own. I've not had to get out loans. I'm very, very proud of that. And I was actually growing to where I could hire employees. As of today, I do not have hired employees. I have 2 women that work their tails off. You'll see our cars parked out there very late at night. We do that because of a love that we have for our business. And I have very many family members that owe me. So they help me. So when I try to apply for all of these grants, loans, I'm kicked out because I'm a sole proprietor that they see as a hobby. I have on April the 4th applied for emergency disaster. Have not heard. I have a number. I'm in line. I've applied also for the Hurricane Harvey to help me out also for a grant from the Texas government. I've not heard anything with that. I have my paperwork in order. I'm ready. I'm a fighter. I want to keep my business going. I think it's vital. I'm located in the Town Plaza Mall. I've known that since I came to Victoria in the late 70s to go to college. And a graduate here from Victoria College, U of H, and like I said, worked in as a school counselor and as a special education teacher in VISD. So worked my way up, and I love Victoria. And I am going to do my best to do what I have to do. I am not asking for any type of money to be given. I am looking at doing something to where I can put this back. I would love to see Victoria do some of the things that Cuero is doing. I don't know if you're aware of that, but Cuero is doing some things to where we can look at long-term, not just the COVID, but support businesses and growing in Victoria. I hear that we want to grow, we want to grow, we want to grow. Watch us grow. Let's plant some seeds to where we can grow. I'm all for it. I don't want money given. Loan is, I want to pay everything back, absolutely. We're not like that. We want to pay back. But I think that would be something cool to do. For Cuero has done it. Corpus Christi has done it. San Antonio has done it. I'd like to see Victoria do something to grow the small businesses, because this one is a mom and mom shop, but mom and pop shops. A lot of the businesses in the Town and Country Shopping Center are run by family only, no employees. Please realize that, and we just need help. COVID had hit us hard. We've been very creative. Right now, we are not open to the full public due to a weakened immune system. We just kind of decided, let's do it small. We're doing curbside, we're doing online, we're delivering, we're doing some different things. I just don't feel comfortable people coming in and touching candy. That's my preference. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, ma'am.
And happy Cinco de Mayo.
Ms. Vella?
Thank you, Council, for allowing me to come in and speak. I appreciate it. I would like to take just a minute and read a post that I posted after our last City Council meeting. It affected me greatly. I listened to the entire council meeting, and I listened to all of the discussion. When I came into the council, started listening to the council meeting, I didn't realize about the LIFT fund or what the suggestions were. So I was a little bit negative coming into the discussion, thinking about the LIFT fund itself. The more I heard Mr. Garza and Raleigh, Mr. McCoy Mayor McCoy speak on, I'm a little nervous, guys, speak on this, the more impactful it was to my life and to my business, and the more I could see it being impactful to small businesses. This is what I wrote. If there was ever a time that we needed Victoria to step up, it's now. So many of our Victoria residents have invested everything in their small mom and pop businesses. We, being the small business community, have a dream to make our city something special. We, the small business community, are willing to sacrifice our time, our health, our energy to see it through. We've made commitments to our staff when we hired them, landlords when we signed leases. We even dared to dream of bigger spaces and expansion in Victoria, specifically, in my case, in the downtown area, as I am in the process of moving from one building to a new building in a larger facility. Through no fault of our own, we have been in the middle of this crisis. I do not believe in handouts, period. I do not believe in handouts. I would like to think of myself as a creative, hardworking person. My personal solution is, if there's a problem that you can't solve, work harder. I've even been accused by my family of creating work when there was none. My pastor confirms one of my biggest faults is that I don't rest. I'm a worker. I'm a worker bee. I get great excitement out of working and seeing a job completed. This crisis has put many of us in positions of need. We need to pay our employees. We're grateful that we can actually provide jobs in this environment. We need to pay our rent. We need to pay our insurances, and we need to buy products to keep the doors open. And yes, we need to pay our taxes. Such taxes that could have been used to keep us alive during this crisis. Our city council declined what I saw was a lifeline. They said, and yes, I listened to the entire meeting. In effect, there was not enough money coming from the national government. There was enough money coming from the national government to pull us little guys out of trouble. In my case, and in many cases around Victoria, that help was not here and is not here. We are in the queue for many grants, and we're in the queue for a little bit of help. But there are too many unanswered questions on how this funding will be done. I really felt that instead of working through those questions on the problems with the LIFT fund, we just did a vote and we said no. It wasn't a no, let's talk about it. It was, in my opinion, these are my opinions, it was a no. I implore you to just come together and try to help us. We're not asking for something for free. The LIFT fund would be money that would be paid back. I don't know if that's still an option or if we have other options out there. But as a small, locally owned business, I love my community and I need to survive. And definitely as a business downtown, me and several other restaurants and businesses downtown, we're the skeleton. If we lose any of our businesses downtown specifically, it's going to be very hard to build on that. And a lot of us have heard and discussed how we want downtown to become this vibrant, wonderful place to be, where we can compete with the New Braunfels and we can compete with the Fredericksburgs and even the Cuero and Goliad. So I just would like to ask my city council to put your heads together and know that I am in the restaurant business, but I've spoken to many, many small businesses, and it's not just the restaurant business. I want to make that clear. From my point of view, from Vela Farms, I would like you to know that we have depleted almost 100% of our operating capital in this crisis. Our employee costs are higher. It takes more people to do less work right now due to the to-go orders, due to the curbside, the different mechanisms that we're working under and the constraints that we're working under actually takes more manpower to do. Our revenue is down. I would like to speak personally to Vela Farms. Our restaurant is down 90% during this coronavirus pandemic. Our catering, we have lost 100% of our catering, which if you look at it in my business, my catering was basically a 50-50 in my restaurant versus the catering. And our retail, what little bit of retail that we do, is down 90 to 95%. We are in need. We cannot sustain these losses for a long period of time. I feel like Vela Farms, we have some opportunities with HEB that are coming around the corner very quickly that will help us specifically, but other businesses don't have that. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Vela. I believe the next one, Mayor Armstrong, would you like to speak?
I want to clarify that our companies will not be applying for these funds, but I was appalled that Texas is noticed for being business friendly, and this is a business friendly decision to make these funds available to other small businesses. And I hope y'all will reconsider and vote on this again, and however many people can change their vote and make this happen. I think it tells something about our community. We're business friendly and we need to stay business friendly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Armstrong. And then last, Lee Keeling. Mr. Keeling.
Mayor, members of council, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak with a mask on. This is the weirdest thing I think I've ever done, but at any rate, my name is Lee Keeling. I live at 112 Spokane Street. I'm the vice president of the Victoria Sales Tax Development Corporation. The comments, though, that I'm going to make tonight are really my own comments. You've heard some compelling testimony, I think, tonight from several sources. And I'd also implore you to reconsider the decision that was made back on the 21st and see if there's not something that we can do reasonably with our economic development funds to support our own struggling small businesses. Just a couple of quick points. Many of you all have heard from me, and I've made some of these points to you. First, at bottom, the funds that are going to be employed to do this are, in fact, taxpayer dollars, but they are taxpayer dollars that have been taken from the taxpayers or on the condition that they be spent for economic development. These funds, although it's a circuitous route that we're using to get them where we think they need to be, are not the funds that you can use to deal with the health care fund emergency. These are economic development funds, and they're for that purpose. And I think keeping in mind what Jesus said about the importance of keeping a vibrant economic development focus for this city is very, very important. So economic development is what these funds are for, and the coronavirus has certainly blown a hole in our local economy. Now, part of the reason that local government exists is to protect the health of the community. The city spends tax money all the time for the public benefit, for the public good. If the city decides that it needs to take somebody's property for the benefit of the public, it has the authority to do that. You can take an easement that you need. You could probably, under your emergency powers, go to Hobby Lobby and tell them you need all the fabric in their inventory because you want to make masks to protect everybody from the COVID-19. But if you do that, you're going to have to pay just compensation. And that makes some amount of sense, right? You're protecting, you're benefiting the public by protecting their health, and they are paying that cost. Now, in the name of public health now, our local businesses, many of them have to close. Some of them have to alter the way they do business, just as Ms. Vela said. They've had to change over from the normal way of doing things to a different way that costs more and generates fewer revenues. Now, the revenues lost by those impacts, these decisions that have basically been made by the government that in order to protect the public health, you need to change the way you're doing things, fall all across our local economy in a haphazard and arbitrary way. But there's no just compensation to those people. They've, just like the person who's given you the easement, or just like Hobby Lobby who's given you all their fabric inventory, they have parted with some of their property. They've lost those revenues, and they've lost them for the benefit of the public good, and the public doesn't have to pay for it. It's a tax. It's an unevenly distributed tax on those merchants and those small businesses that they've got to bear. It seems like the least we could do is try to loan them back some of those lost revenues that they otherwise had the legal authority to earn and to keep. Finally, make one further point. And this goes to, I don't know what you all are going to discuss. I'm anxious to hear the rest of the discussion tonight. The proposal brought forward on the 21st involved the use of a community development financial institution, the LIF Fund. Now, there are other organizations like that. City staff, in my mind, did a good job of evaluating and vetting that organization and brought a quality organization to us to take a look at. And I'm not making a pitch for them in particular necessarily, but what I liked about what they did, the more I thought about the program that was proposed, was that these are people whose business it is to take funds that are donated to them, grants that are given to them, and take them out and loan them, as it's what they do every day, to small and very small businesses in very small amounts. That means a lot of administrative costs. That means a lot of hand-holding because lots of these businesses aren't quite as sophisticated and aren't used to using the normal channels of business credit that that larger companies are using. So my point is that I saw that as, a reasonable way to do this and to do it quickly and to do it with people who would make reasonable and prudent loans, business loans, to people that are deserving and that will benefit from them. And finally, I just want to say notions of corporate welfare or we always get something for the economic development dollars that we spend just don't seem apt to me at this point. The city can reasonably and rationally spend economic development funds to create a loan fund that will support the recovery of our local small businesses who've really had to shoulder an inordinate burden of a public benefit, a benefit to all of us that allows us to be safe. And I think that's the sort of economic development that we need in the current environment. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Keeling. Okay. No one else signed up to speak to this order, so I think we'll move on into the work session. Does council wish to have a small break for the discussion? What if the mayor does?
Right to call it.
I think the mayor gets
Yeah,
the mayor.
I think that's what he was asking.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
At least I asked.
Hey, James,
The
I need you to pull
recess
up
will
my
resume
PPT.
the meeting, please. I'm going to go into the work session. I don't want to clear up something about the language of the work session where it says discussion and possible action on programs to assist recovery and development of small businesses and with possible action. I don't expect action to be taken on a particular program tonight. What I would like to see is maybe direction. If we find a way that we can work to help our small businesses to give direction to staff to bring back some sort of detailed proposal with actual details of what it might be as it comes out of this discussion. So I'm not looking for a vote on a particular thing tonight for approval. I'm looking for direction. Okay?
Okay.
So I think Mr. Garza has a...
Sure. Yeah. So the mayor asked me to facilitate a discussion by doing a couple of things. One, taking a deeper dive, I should say, into the reflection that I quickly somewhat alluded to at the last meeting. There have been questions that have come up since then that have been emailed to us or have just come up that I want to try and just at least get out there. There is also some, I don't want to use the word confusion, but maybe there's some misunderstanding about what the LIV fund proposal was and what it wasn't. And so I want to just clarify a few items related to it just to make sure that you and the public really understand exactly what it was and what it wasn't. And it's strictly from the perspective of simply information. And so I'll go ahead and let's see if this works. So this slide, I literally simply took from that same presentation that I gave at the last council meeting and quickly talked about how this was the reflection that I went through towards the beginning and the latter part of March. And so I want to provide some context for you. We also went ahead and put a binder of just resources for you, some of which I'll reference. And a lot of this, obviously, you'll take home and hopefully read on. But I'll reference them so that you can kind of understand them in context and then have a conversation on some topics. The very first question is, of course, what is the role of the city in economic development? There has been a lot of chatter, about, well, why is the city involved in this conversation to begin with? And the reality is that we've been involved in economic development since ever, right? And continue to be. Now, we could take a hardcore, broad approach and say that everything that we do is economic development. And at the end of the day, yes, it is, right? And obviously, we wouldn't have economic development if we didn't have the infrastructure, if our community wasn't safe, if we didn't have certain quality of life components, et cetera, et cetera. But specific to economic development, we have been involved, whether directly or indirectly, on things like this for a very long time, right? One of the first items that is in your binder is a presentation that I gave in June of 2019 that provided some more information on just how we're structured with economic development. We shared some of the history related to VEDC and how it first began in the early 80s, and eventually when VSTDC was formed in the mid-90s, some of that sales tax dollars started funneling over to VEDC. You've heard me allude to, and some of you might have even been involved in this process, but around 20 years ago, there was a process spearheaded by VEDC to have a community economic development strategic plan. Even though it was spearheaded by VEDC, it was really a community effort with a lot of partners, whether it was university, city, county, chamber, et cetera, that played a role in that. And there was a steering committee that was put in place for that. We ourselves at the city have an economic development policy that was adopted in 2015, and that's what we utilize when we consider abatements and other key projects. You know, we obviously have ongoing conversations about 380 agreements with different developments. And in 2016, Council adopted the Victoria 2035 Comp Plan, which also has a very specific section on economic competitiveness. And so all of these documents are in your binder simply as reference, because I think it's important to educate the public that the city has been involved with economic development for a long time, in some cases maybe more intentionally than others, but it is at our core, a core function of what the city is involved with. Now, the specific project that was presented, if we were to sort of take a deeper dive into economic development and try and figure out, well, what's the category that it fits in? Well, it fits under business retention. And so I wanted to highlight some of the mentions of business retention in some of these planning documents that are in front of you to make a couple of points. One, it's an ongoing effort that is very relevant of economic development. But second, we probably as a community haven't quite focused enough on it. In the strategic plan from 2000, it very specifically talks about the need to increase our emphasis on retention and expansion of local businesses. That same strategic plan recommends establishing a microenterprise revolving loan fund. That document is one of your tabs. The economic development policy that the city adopted in 2015 also mentioned supporting and expanding existing businesses. The Victoria 2035, that master plan or vision plan or comp plan, I should say, literally one of the goals says increase emphasis on retaining and expanding local businesses and industries. They're clearly, through the exercise of a lot of these planning documents, we've been communicated or suggested that we should look at ramping up our business retention and expansion efforts. Now, what that looks like is up to interpretation. Everybody has different opinions on how to do that. But the fact that there's a consistent theme that we should look at greater emphasis on business retention, I think, is of note. I don't believe I'm the only person that sees that. You know, Councilman Bachnight, last year when we were having conversations about the VDC contract, that was one of the issues that as a member of VSTDC, you wanted to see more of, and we made some minor adjustments to the contract with VSTDC and VDC related to the retention piece, because I think you recognize that that is something that as a community we could do a better job of. And so I think it's important for people to understand that this is something that has been suggested to us, and this specific program could fall within this category, if you will.
May I ask just a process question?
Oh, yes, sir.
Mr. Mayor, do you want to go through most of this and then come back and discuss?
I'd like to do that, just go through the document, and then we'll reserve our comments.
Yeah, and I've got some very specific also slides where it's for discussion with questions. And I'll speed this up for you.
And the reason I think some of it sort of interplays with the others, so I think we need to get the basis and then use that as the basis for our discussion.
I'll take notes.
Yeah, and I also think it's important that we educate the public. Obviously, this is something new, right? Something that our community hasn't been exposed to, and so I think it's important to put as much information out there as possible. The next reflection question was, what are other communities doing to help? And the reality is that communities, and I'll give you some examples, have either established a grant program or a loan program, and I'll walk through some of those. They have been spearheaded by different entities, and so some programs are spearheaded by cities or counties, others by EDCs or chambers of commerce. Some larger communities have other entities or other nonprofits that play a role in business retention, and so they've stepped up. But at the end of the day, even though they involve all these entities, for the most part, it's been a collaborative effort between these and also CDFIs, and I'll get to that here in a second. For instance, with city-led programs, in our research, the majority of programs that were spearheaded by cities they did them in partnership with EDC or Chamber of Commerce or with a CDFI. For those that ask, well, why did you not look at a traditional bank? Well, quite frankly, we didn't because no other city was doing it that way. No other city was partnering with a traditional bank. Cities that were partnering with third-party entities were partnering with CDFIs. And there are a lot of CDFIs, I shouldn't say a lot, there's over a dozen CDFIs across the state. Most of them are geographically based. And I'll get to talking about the ones that do work in Victoria here in a second. But that's what we came across in that research. Some examples, and I shared with this last time, no secret, San Antonio, Corpus Christi, these are cities that spearhead the effort and partner with a CDFI. I'll note that in Corpus Christi's case, they made an agreement with their Type A Economic Development Corporation where they did a switcheroo very similar to what we proposed, where the city took this $2 million originally, and then they added another $2.5 million to it for a total of $4.5, and said we're taking that $4.5 million from the street fund, and then the Type A agreed to fund the street projects to sort of backfill that. And so that's the way that Corpus did it. Now, it's not only large cities that are doing this, and so I want to show you some smaller cities on programs that are what appear to be driven by the city, but again, include community development corporations or EDCs. But you'll notice Leander, Bernie, McKinney, Marble Falls, smaller communities in San Antonio and Corpus, but you'll notice that they also established some programs. You'll notice that some of the smaller cities establish grant programs versus loan programs. There is overlap, and you notice that obviously in a grant program, the amount is much smaller. EDC-led programs, I think it's important to note that going back to the presentation that I gave last summer, our traditionally structured sales tax funded EDC is our VSTDC. And so when we look at what other EDCs are doing in terms of the roles that they're playing in these programs across the state, I think it's important to note that these are EDCs that are predominantly backed by sales tax dollars and are more traditionally structured versus ours. One way to think of it is we have two EDCs, where one is the sales tax driven one, right, which focuses on infrastructure projects, and then contracts with a second EDC to focus on the marketing aspect on primary jobs. Examples, Harlingen EDC. Harlingen EDC developed a $1 million program. Their loans were a small amount. From my understanding, their direction was we want to help 100 businesses, and so they said, well, we'll do loans up to $10,000, and they allocated the $1 million, and of course they partnered with the city of Harlingen to do that. Fort Worth Community Development Corporation, they actually partnered with the CDFI themselves as well as the city and allocated $1 million. In their particular case, loans were up to $50,000. And as you can see, they're kind of all over the place, right? There is no one-size-fits-all model here. So you'll see some smaller communities, some smaller EDCs with some smaller figures. Again, combination of grant programs or loan programs. Chambers have also stepped up, and so in some communities, chambers have also spearhead some of these programs. Cedar Park Chamber, Pflugerville, Georgetown, Taylor, those chambers appear to be spearheading some processes. You go to the chamber website and fill out the application. It's the chamber that's spearheading the review process through a committee. It might incorporate, some members from the EDC or the city, but they appear to be chamber-driven initiatives, and naturally they're smaller amounts. And again, in some cases it's grants, in some cases it's loans. So there's a lot out there, right? There's no one size fits all. My next reflection question was, what are we capable of implementing? And rather than using capable, I probably should have used a different word, because what I really meant was trying to figure out, what do we think would work here, right? And that's where we get into the conversation, or the first question, which is, grant versus loan. And this isn't all the pros and cons or anything, and this isn't necessarily listed out as pros and cons. But these were some of the things that were reflected on in looking at a grant versus a loan. A grant, one-time assistance, does not have to be repaid. Consequently, it's a less robust underwriting process and typically smaller amounts. The benefit there, of course, is that you can help more businesses with a smaller amount. With a grant program, it's probably quicker, right? And so there are some benefits to a grant. And under grants, just like you can do in loans, you can stipulate all types of stipulations. And so, for instance, some communities were saying, we're doing a grant program, but we're only doing them as bridge grants. And so some communities are saying, you have to show proof that you're going through the process with SBA, for instance, but we recognize that that's going to take 3 to 4 months. And so we'll do a bridge grant for you. and sort of take the risk that you'll eventually get the SBA loan. But in the meantime, we'll give you a grant. So we can structure it however we want. On the loan side, there's the opportunity to recover funds and or continuing to assist. Obviously, if there's some type of partnership, and this isn't taking LIFN into account, this is just generalities, right? The concept of a loan creates an opportunity to do something more afterwards versus a grant doesn't. Must be repaid, so there's an extra level of responsibility on the end user. There's a more robust underwriting process, obviously, because there's a expectation that that user is going to repay that back. And typically what we noticed in doing some of this research is that typically on the loan programs, those amounts were larger. And that's significant because one of the things that was part of the reflection was at the end of the day, we want to make sure that whatever we invest in is going to have an impact. And so what do we think is going to have a greater impact on the likelihood of a business succeeding? Is it going to be a one-time $5,000 grant where they take the chance on getting some financial support in the future from a different source? Or is it providing a loan up to $25,000 that will garner more capital for them and giving them a higher likelihood of staying afloat, right? And so through this exercise, we thought loan, right? We thought in our community, what do we think will have the most impact and what will create the most opportunity to do something more than just this one time? And the loan option created that opportunity. Who can we partner with, right? That's the next question. As you can tell, as we were doing research and started getting exposed to all these communities, it's chamber, it's CDC, it's city, it's partnering with CDFIs, it's all these things. And it's like, well, what do we have, right? And so obviously with us, we do have VDC and we have the chamber. You have included in your binder letters from the chamber and VEDC, them communicating formally to us what they're able to do as it relates to either a loan or a grant. Oops, that went too quick. Let me go back. So on the VDC's front, obviously it's no secret that VDC focuses on primary jobs. That's their bread and butter. That's what they focus on. A loan program is outside the current scope and expertise of VDC staff. And so their position, and I want to make this very clear, neither the chamber or the VDC is necessarily taking a position on the LIFT fund proposal that was considered, but VDC simply is saying that if council does want to pursue a program where there's issuance of loans, that perhaps it ought to look at partnering with somebody that has more experience and subject matter expertise in that topic. And VEDC is willing and able to collaborate with us and others if we were to establish a grant program. Grant program presents an opportunity for there to be a more robust application and screening process, right? And so with a grant, whatever that screening criteria is, you could set up a committee, you could do all sorts of things. Versus a loan, it's a little bit more black and white in terms of the underwriting process. But we can place some parameters, and so we'll get to that a little later as well. But that was sort of the assumption I had made about VEDC, right, leading into the discussion last month, and now it's formalized through a discussion that they had as a board. And I do want to thank Dale and Jeff at the chamber for having those uncomfortable conversations with their boards. This is something completely new, and so I do want to commend them for, humoring or entertaining, I should say, the conversation, because I do think that regardless of whether a program is come up with or not, clearly there's opportunities for all of these entities that touch economic development to have more cohesive initiatives, conversations, you name it, so that in the future some of this stuff can figure itself out a little easier. Anyway, Chamber of Commerce, again, no surprise that the vision of the Chamber of Commerce is focused on their members, as it should be. And so they focus on their members. They currently, through COVID, have been focused their efforts on facilitation of existing resources. If you haven't had a chance to follow the Facebook page Together for Victoria, they man that. Jeff, posts on that 24/7. I don't think he sleeps, but he's constantly sharing different items on that page. Due to financial and staffing limitations, they are also of the opinion that if the city wanted to establish a loan program, that the best route would be to partner with a third-party entity, regardless of who it is, that has more experience and established procedures on it. And similar to the VDC, the Chamber and Jeff, they're willing to participate in some type of collaborative effort should we go the grant route. And again, those letters are in your binder as well. CDFIs is the other option in terms of partnership. I provided a lot of reading material for you under the tab of what is a CDFI, because I felt that one of the items that, quite frankly, maybe I could have done a better job of communicating at the last meeting was just the role that CDFIs play. And the reality is that CDFIs fill a gap or a void that was noticed back in the 70s, and CDFIs were created through the Community Reinvestment Act. And the reality is that there's a lot of small business owners that historically until this day don't have access to traditional financing mechanisms. And whether it's because of their credit score or whether it's because of their financials or whatever the case may be, or maybe their loan amount isn't high enough for a traditional bank to consider, there are many factors that impact the access to capital when it comes to small businesses. And so CDFIs were created to help fill that void. And it's important to note that these CDFIs get predominantly their funding through the federal government, through the Department of Treasury. There's a link that I put up there for people that are interested in going and looking. But this is a very sort of specifically targeted, intentional effort to try and fill this void to players that don't have access to some of these traditional means. Now, how it relates to our current situation is that there are a lot of people that would argue that even though the SBA is creating these PPP programs, that these same people that don't have as easy access to traditional financing mechanisms during a non-emergency declaration state will continue to have those challenges, whether it's because they don't bank with a large bank or whatever the case may be. There are articles out there that talk about the split, that even though the funding that gets approved by the federal government for the SBAs and the 300 billion or whatever it is, that only a portion of that really is going to CDFIs or community banks. We have some community banks in town, and quite frankly, they've been extremely successful in working with their clients. But a lot of people don't have that. And so there's a legitimate gap there that was identified in a normal situation that now some would argue exists through the recovery phase. The other thing to note is that CDFIs focus on microlending. And so CDFIs focus on $50,000 or less. And so if we wanted to simply use a financial sort of barrier or distinction, is that CDFIs only deal with $50,000 or less loans. And in your reading materials, there's articles and there's all information about studies that were made that show the effectiveness of CDFIs, and how even people that question the reasoning for CDFIs to exist in the 80s and 90s now see that there is benefit in supporting some of these markets or underserved areas that don't have access to traditional banking systems. And that is why communities partner with CDFIs. And so I would argue that even if we don't partner with a CDFI, it's something that we should not forget, because our CDFIs play a big role in our efforts to do economic development. CDFIs in Victoria, briefly on the SBDC, because quite frankly, the SBDC was a resource for us, right? I mean, we don't lend, right? And so we have no idea who's out there. And so naturally, the first phone call was to Lindsay at SBDC. And it's like, hey, who have you worked with? Who has a presence in Victoria? What does that look like? And from the get-go, Live Fund stood out. Live Fund has been in our community for a while. They were present during Harvey. And so the team at SBDC had nothing but great things to say about Live Fund because of their existing presence. They might physically not have an office here, but they have an office out of Corpus, where that individual spends quite a bit of time here and working with different clients. During the Live Fund presentation last month, they talked about how they currently have, I think it was over 30 clients that they currently have in Victoria. However, and that's why they're listed at major. There's a minor CDFI that's called People Fund that SBDC has not formally worked with. That as far as the SBDC was concerned, they probably have a handful of clients in Victoria, but they don't coordinate anything through SBDC. They weren't involved with the issuance of any funds post-Harvey. And so even though technically there was a second CDFI that Lindsay knew of, If we approach this the same way that we might approach any other professional service, where we evaluate things like familiarity with the community or track record or expertise, or things of that sort, Lift Fund was going to stand above that. And so once we got past that stage, then it was like, okay, well, let's initiate that conversation. And so really quickly hit on some clarifying points on the Lift Fund proposal. I know that there was, I think, a question or two about the mechanism of the 380 agreement, which is what we had recommended. And so I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Sure. I can just briefly talk on whether or not a 380 agreement is the correct vehicle for creating this sort of project. Chapter 380 of the local government code is what allows cities to do economic development projects. It's a very, very short chapter of the code. The whole thing fits on one page. It might be the shortest chapter of statute ever written. But when a city adopts a program for economic development, the agreement that you use with someone to carry out that project gets called a 380 agreement. The fact that it's called a 380 agreement doesn't define what the terms of that contract are. That's simply a reference back to the fact that it is an economic development project being carried out through a contractual arrangement.
And so regardless of who we would partner with for anything, whether it be the chamber or VDC or a different CDFI or whatever, it would be the 380 setup that we would pursue. This is also very same slide that was presented last month. I added a couple of sub-bullets at the very bottom, simply to clarify a little bit of the funding. There's been some mention about, VSTDC funds, and so I wanted to just clarify and actually put on the presentation that this switch or play of money that we're referring to would support a park project that VSTDC has done in the past. And the TxDOT overpass funds, as mentioned earlier, those were allocated in January for park projects. I think it's important to note that on the VSTDC front, as I showed earlier, there's projected to be a healthy fund balance, and so there is that capacity for VSTDC to go back and assist with park projects next year. Couple of clarifying points. This is practically the same slide. I mentioned that the loans would range in value up to $25,000 with a maximum of 3-year term. I don't recall if I referenced that there was the second option, which was loans up to $15,000 that would have a 24-month or a 2-year term turnaround. And I wanted to clarify this next point, the 0% interest and 120-day deferral of first payment. What we were intending to represent here is that the zero interest is for the life of the loan, not just for 120 days. Some people interpreted this bullet to represent that 0% was only for 4 months, and that $70,000 that we referenced as interest buy down was only for 4 months. And of course, that's a lot of money for 4 months of interest, right, on $680,000. But it was intended to represent the life of the loan. The rest of it, I mean, you all are familiar with. There was a question about, well, could we help more businesses? Well, we could if the loan amounts were smaller, right? What we added on there was 34 businesses would benefit at an average of $20,000 a loan. Obviously, if it's $10,000 a loan, that's twice that, 68 businesses. And these are all things that we can establish our own parameters. Back to the mayor's point, if today council suggests, we like a loan, but we think $25,000 is too much, we would like to consider something that's 10 or 15. That's the kind of feedback that we want, so that then we can go back and try and figure out what we can come up with whomever. Who qualifies? There was some confusion on bullet 2. There was some confusion about this August 2019 date. Originally, I think the newspaper also wrote it incorrectly, and then they corrected it after the fact. So our intention was to show that who qualified would be a business that had been in operation prior to August 2019, which makes sense, right? Because ultimately there's going to be an underwriting process that requires X amount of months of financials, you name it. And some people interpreted this to mean that it's only new businesses that had been established after August 2019. And so I wanted to clarify that point. I also want to clarify on the last point on these parameters. Richard mentioned from Lift Fund that they already have 2 main types of businesses that they don't fund regardless of whether the fund is what it is or with who, which was the sexually oriented businesses and anything related to real estate. And Councilwoman Scott had brought up the idea of placing some additional parameters, and the reality is that that's also up to you. And so if we wanted to put parameters around, requiring that they're up to date on, taxes, or that they're sales tax contributing businesses or whatever it is, that is up to us, however we want to do that. Who would participate? Non-essential businesses, which of course now, some of them are operational. I think beginning Friday, was the latest that came out just right before this. I was joking with Jeff earlier that the timing of our conversations are interesting, right? As we were having the council meeting last month, right, the Congress or the Senate passed, that additional appropriation bill for the SBA loans. And then today, the governor says that these non-essential businesses can open on Friday. Regardless, though, the reality is that businesses have been impacted. And so some will need assistance, whether it's from us or from somebody else. I wanted to just a couple of clarifying points here. I wanted to, again, clarify that the $70,000 that would be sort of part of the grant to Lift Fund is for interest buy down, which is representative of the life of that entire loan, not just for the 120-day deferral period. And I wanted to also clarify a little bit on the additional revenue, on additional grants and donations. And so one of the things that I think, again, I could have probably elaborated more on last time, was that the way these programs typically work is that anybody can contribute to this. And so the moment that that the fund is set up, if you wanted to write a personal check for $1,000 to contribute to the cause, you could. If a foundation in town wanted to do it, if whoever wanted to do it can contribute to the account. And so that's what we mean by the additional grants and donations that was meant in terms of commitment. While there wasn't necessarily a guarantee, that's how that fund sort of grows, if you will, is because it's able to accept grants and donations from others. One of the other things, too, that I noted last month was that there was no service fee charge on our proposal. And unlike proposals that they made in larger communities where there was a processing fee. Everybody's aware that the fund would incur the defaults. One of the clarifying points on this slide there was some confusion about the establishment of a permanent revolving fund. And so I wanted to make it very clear that the proposal with Lift Fund would establish a permanent revolving fund, and that was the only option with Lift Fund in order to establish a relationship with Lift Fund. And as I alluded to earlier, this Dream Makers Fund, which is what would have been the title of the permanent revolving fund, is able to receive additional dollars from private donors, foundations, et cetera. And all the funds are restricted. There was also some confusion about some people thinking that, okay, yes, the first round of lending is for businesses in Victoria, but once it goes into a permanent revolving fund, what happens to it? Who's able to qualify for that? Does it go into a larger pool? And really what was meant was that those funds are forever restricted to being spent only in the city limits of Victoria. And so the topics for discussion that I thought you might be interested in providing some insight on was financial support. And so what I meant by that was it would help us as we hopefully walk away today with some direction on something to put together to get a sense for where council is on the 750. So, is council okay with the 750, or does council want to change that amount? It would be helpful for us to get a sense of that. It would be helpful for us to get a sense of the grant versus a loan. Even though we proposed the loan program, we're not closed off from it being a grant program, should that be the direction of council. And so we want to get some, hopefully some direction from that. If it is a loan, we want to get ideally some direction on the permanent revolving fund question or issue or comment or whatever you want to call it. And then lastly, simply just get a sense of I guess, appetite for partnership. Again, the intent is for us to simply just take what you discuss and then hopefully come back to you as soon as possible with something, whether it's with Lift Fund or somebody else or whatever. And I do want to also take a quick second to also apologize for whatever position I might have put you in for bringing that item in a very quick fashion. In retrospect, one might think, well, maybe this conversation would have been more prudent to have first. But the reality is, we were trying to assist businesses in a quick fashion in a very changing landscape. And so we brought to you what we felt was the best that we could with the information that we had in front of us. But at the end of the day, myself and staff are cognizant that our role is to implement whatever policy direction comes from council. And as I told those that were in my interview a year ago or a little over than a year ago, I'm going to be the type of city manager that prefers to be told, hey, that's a bad idea, or hey, slow down, than be told you're not coming up with enough ideas. And so this is a perfect example of that. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions or simply be here as a resource as you have this discussion.
Okay, thank you. Kind of at the start, I'd like to say I thought at the end of the last meeting there was a lot of things that weren't understood. I think the 380 agreement wasn't as complete as it could have been with some of the questions that were asked. At the end of the meeting, I think I used the term back to the drawing board. So I've tried to go back to the drawing board. I did have discussions with some of the bank officers here. I talked with Royce Moran, the commercial lending guy, because somebody insinuated, gosh, could we just give $750,000 to a bank and let them do it? And in my conversations with him, probably not. Their regulations and stuff would make it very difficult for them to oversee these types of loans. I called William at Frost, and he took a day and actually went and did some research and came back with essentially the same deal. And the other thing that I caught in a conversation with John Zacek, the PPP funds seem to be more geared toward W-2 heavy type businesses. We have more employees that get W-2s, and that's a payroll type arrangement. Your sole proprietors, like we've had sit here kind of in a no man's land, the way that it was described to me, by the time you put the formula together of what their payroll is versus other expenses, they don't score enough to get where they need to be. Both of them were familiar with these community development financial institutions is what they are. And so I think for what I would throw open to discussion, what is council's appetite? Do you see, and I don't take for a minute, I think there were comments made publicly that council doesn't care about businesses or development. I would probably take exception to that. But many times in the heat of frustration, people say things. So I would like us to gather back like we've always done and have civil discussion and talk about the facts of the matter. And I don't think for a minute that any of you doesn't feel a need to try to help some of our businesses if we can find a way that we can agree upon to move forward. So I'd just like to make that clear before we begin. So again, I think we're back to, are we willing to try to do financial support? Are we in favor of more grants versus loans? And I can tell you that from what I've done, these CDFIs have different policies. There is a CDFI that has a program that doesn't create a fund. It has essentially the same type of mechanisms. There's a drawdown. There's grants involved to that. That would take I think it would take an actual comparison of the two to look at the final number. That particular fund usually uses larger funds. They don't forgive zero. They're not zero interest for more than a few months, and they tend to stretch out the loans much longer, which gives them much more income to make their income. So there are other options with these CDFIs. If it's determined that's the only type of mechanism that can do loans that we want to look at. And I think, and you can correct me, Mr. Gooch, I think you can, this type of deal is not a competitive type situation. We could actually look at proposals from two different ones to look at and analyze.
Right, we don't have to go out to bid it
No.
because it's professional services.
Right. Well, it's something a little different than
That's
professional
correct.
services. They don't fall under the heading of what's prescribed. So you could, and they deal completely different. They're not an apples to apples type business. So that's one thing we could do. Or if there's the appetite to look at a grant, I think both VDC and I believe in letters that I got and the chamber would be willing to assist in those types of programs. But the thing is, do we want to create a grant that simply the money goes? Or do we want to create a loan type program where we can get some of it back? And I think in one of the other fund proposals, you ultimately get money back, but it's quite a ways down the line because their loans are so long. So those are kind of the deals. For me personally, I want to find a way to help our businesses the fastest we can. I think there's a concern about, well, these are small businesses. What do they really affect? The loan on one lift fund in particular sets that they can't have an annual gross income of over $1 million. Well, if you did 30 businesses, just to make the math easy, if we loan 30 businesses and they grossed $100,000 a year, that's $3 million of economic activity in a year. If they would do half of it, if you got 30 companies that generated $500,000 in gross revenues, that's $15 million of economic activity. And I'm not putting multipliers on it like people do, because it's a deal, that's just basic math. If you had 30 that had $1 million, that's $30 million. So it has more impact than one would think at first glance in terms of just generating economic activity within our community, even though these seem relatively small. I think their income, I think we shouldn't diminish the economic impact potential there for doing something. So,
I would like to see, if we go forward with anything, it'd be a loan, that it be decoupled from any Dreammaker type of fund. And what I wanted to talk to Mr. Garza about was just a clarification on that business retention slide, where the strategic plan from 2000 to 2004 that dealt with that micro lending plan, right? Because in my discussions with some people over the past couple of weeks, I said, well, this has always been a VEDC plan to have this micro lending plan. That's what one of the VDC board members told me. And another one also said it was a perfect opportunity to put this on top of the COVID-19 emergency, which I don't think is what we are here to talk about and do. But in that strategic plan, it was not intended that this be a taxpayer-funded micro-lending plan as far as taxpayers that are local tax dollars. If you look in that plan on page 16, ID 2, right? This was envisioned to be to use other funds for it. And also in that strategic plan, we look in the front end, it's not listed as critical, significant, or beneficial priority issues analysis. So it's not high priority, it would seem to me, for VEDC to set this up. And in fact, they handed it over to a different entity.
SBDC.
SBDC. After just a few months, or a year, or no, June 2000, and in May 2001, just about a year, they handed the program's creation over to the Small Business Development Corporation. So for those reasons, this wasn't envisioned as being a City of Victoria sales tax use type of micro-lending fund. Never has been the plan. And to suggest otherwise going forward is not truthful. So I would like to see this whole program decoupled. I'd like to see a public-private partnership where this front-end cost could be covered by private donations, and the public can put up maybe the money to be loaned out. We could start with 18 people that were compelled to write a letter to the editor saying that we don't care for small businesses. You know, they put up $4,000, it would pay for that upfront cost. We do that. We get repaid for all the loans that are given out. I gave all of y'all a list of some criteria that I see very beneficial to have in such a type of loan program. One being sales tax filings over the past year, quarterly 941 reports, annual 940 reports, your federal income tax filing, your state franchise tax filing, last 4 quarters of state unemployment tax filings, purposes of the loan money to be stated. I've seen some other lists that have come around that are great too. They add some other things that I think we need to have collateral and personal guarantees on the loans.
Then you're talking about a bankable loan, and that's not what these are. These are gap loans. These CDFIs were set up specifically to deal with these companies that aren't necessarily bankable, and they've been doing it. The two that I'm aware of have been doing it for probably 25 years. So it's a special type of lending. They look at it differently than a bank does. And I would argue with you, there was a deal about the PPP funds being very vetted. That's another thing I found out. They don't require nearly what they do when they're lending bank money because it's guaranteed by the SBA. So when I see some of the loans that were made that are now given back, I would question the federal government's lending practices, quite frankly. And those two are my tax. And those two are my tax money.
And that's what I'm trying to avoid.
But the thing is, tax money is the fastest thing we can get to people. So if you believe that somebody should rely on federal tax money as opposed to local tax money, I don't see the argument. I've heard comments, well, government shouldn't be in the banking business. If you know anything about the FDCI and the Federal Reserve System, I would argue with you that the government is the bank because they control so much of the banking industry. So that to me is not a valid argument. They're about using taxpayer money. Everything we send to Washington, that's our money too.
But you got to make that, you got to kind of look at that. That's the federal government, right? They have the power to print money.
Yeah, and when they do, they devalue the dollar.
I know.
And they raise inflation. We have the capacity locally. We have funding here that's not going to break us, that can help our vulnerable businesses the fastest and more completely than any of the other options they have. And there's some of them hanging on by a thread.
Well, Mr. Mayor, what I see this problem is two separate problems. I think we have the emergent problem with COVID-19. I think we'd all understand that. Lift Fund tried to put the Dream Makers Fund on the backside of it, and they won't do this without this, is what it sounds like. They're tied together. These are two separate things. They're both valid. But if we're trying to get money to people in this emergent time, we have one thing. I think we can perfect the long-term thing, and I think that this was great information, and I appreciated Jesus in regards to our options, and that's something that I struggled with, was that we were really presented with one option last time, and it's hard to make an honest and right decision when you're only presented with one thing. I'd like to think about the emergent situation and what we can do, and we can take the long-term thing and make sure we do that right. And I think it's very important to be correct. And I think everybody up here understands how important small business, and we're not poo-pooing you. We want to do the right thing, though. And so can we address the immediate need, which is the need of now, and how do we best serve that? And then can we also do our due diligence? Because there's a lot of options out there. I've been on looking at different municipalities and seeing what they're doing, and there's a whole host, whether it's through the municipality. We haven't even talked about county being involved in this. I would love for them to be involved with this as well. There's a lot of layers to this to get to, I think, the quote-unquote dream makers or long-term revolving fund, but I think we really need to address the short-term emergent need.
Well, to your point, you know, the local people that some of these other cities have partnered with, they're EDCs. We know that our EDC is not set up like many others are that have capacity. We've reached out to them. We've been told that they just don't have the staff or the knowledge to set up a loan program. They would be happy to do it. So I honestly think with all of the options that some sort of CDFI is the quickest way. They are in the business of making these loans. They deal with them. They actually, if I talk to Lindsay right, it's a loan program, but yet they tutor them too in ways to help them in their quest to pay these loans back. It's more of a service that goes. In other words, the bank isn't going to loan you money and come visit you every other week, Councilman Balknight, and say, right, how you doing? Can I help you figure out how to do this? And I think that's a service that sometimes happens. So I guess would there be an appetite for council to consider if we could bring back 2 proposals from CDFIs, one a more detailed one from LIFT Fund and another one from this other CDI that is not coupled to a permanent fund.
I'm sorry, Ms. Scott.
Go
ahead.
And here's the reason why, because, and I appreciate you because you're good at this, at looking at the total dollars at the end and how it turns out. So I think if we brought back 2 options like that we could study side by side and see the details of them, then we would have something we could vote on.
You brought up page 16. At the very last sentence of it, SBDC would issue funds. Do they have the ability to issue funds?
They do not. So I spoke.
Okay, I didn't know why that was.
Yeah, I spoke to Lindsay about that today, just to kind of get, I guess, a fresh opinion from SBDC on this, because this was, she said, like 4 directors ago. Her opinion was that this was incorrect to even assume that the SBDC would be involved with it, because it's not SBDC's role to establish revolving funds. It might have been the intent to suggest that SBDC is involved with facilitating, similar to the role that they play now. And to Jeff's point about the different funding mechanisms, you know, it suggests and references the Community Reinvestment Act that I suggested earlier, which is what created the CDFI, and mentions CDBG dollars. And I don't know if it's come up in the past when there's conversations on how to spend CDBG dollars, but typically there is an option to spend CDBG dollars on economic development. I think we have simply chosen to prioritize those dollars, since they're not a lot, on helping our social service agencies. And so but that's a long answer to your question, but SBDC does not have funds. They simply are a resource and facilitate SBA loans or whatever other programs might be out there.
Okay.
The majority of the Sales Tax Corporation board believed that the LIFT Fund was the right thing to do. That's why it all came about. It was presented by Jesus, and I don't fault you for I think it's great that you brought it up. And to me, there was enough information at the last thing. I think more questions should have been asked. If you're trying to find alternatives, there aren't any alternatives that are any good.
Mark, Mr. Lofgren, were you presented with any other alternatives at your meeting?
No, but I went home and investigated them.
So you got one option and you determined that it was the best option.
After I went home and investigated it, yeah.
I'd like to also add that when I was appointed to the Sales Tax Board as a citizen, one of the things that was pointed out to me was that by design, the Sales Tax Board is made up of a majority of citizens and a minority of council. Okay. By the second part of the design, the Sales Tax Board can't spend any money without council approval. Right. Council can't spend sales tax dollars without sales tax approval. Therefore, the check and balance is sales tax development may be bringing this, but council has a vote in it too. And I think that's very significant, because some of the questions that Mr. Young's asked are just in general. sales tax can recommend this to us, but there are a lot of issues that I have with this whole concept. It may not be my time to speak, but I've just got a lot of issues with it. To me, I would ask council, are you willing to raise taxes by 2 cents to fund this? Because we're talking about the equivalent of 2 cents of ad valorem taxes. When I look around.
It isn't from ad valorem.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't.
I thought it was just sales tax.
If you're going to call it sales tax, then let's make it be a sales tax program. Let's give it the 60 days and let's do it properly. If you're going to transparently say you're being dishonest about what you're doing, I'm not comfortable with that, and I'm not comfortable asking our citizens to do that. I understand that there's lots of smoke and mirrors in the way we're trying to move this money around. But the fact is, if we were to fund this money today, it would not be sales tax dollars. It would be city general fund dollars.
Which would be reimbursed with sales tax development.
Can I add a clarifying point, if you don't mind? You're 100% correct that they are general fund. Well, they're not in our general fund.
Somewhere that we can spend.
And so I just want to clarify that while you are correct that the VSTDC dollars wouldn't be the ones that initially fund this project, I also want to clarify that the source that they're coming from is through the TxDOT overpass funds. And while, yes, technically we can spend them for a variety of different things, just how we have had that discussion, I think it's important to note, just to not cause more confusion for somebody that might be tuning in, that this original source that we're discussing isn't necessarily in competition, if we want to call it that, with our normal operation. If these dollars were in competition with anything, they would be in competition with one-time things that we might want to fund in the future. But it is not something that would impact the property tax rate. You're correct, though, that if we did the math, that it would equate to about the 2 cents. But I don't want people to get the impression that if you did invest a certain amount of money, that it would equate to some type of increase. I just want to make that clarifying point.
However, that is a potential source for it if we feel that strongly about it.
For one-time expenses, yes.
For one time.
Yes, not for recurring, but for one time.
I think in Jesus's presentation, he made a good statement that VEDC and the chamber had uncomfortable conversations. Well, I feel like we're having an uncomfortable conversation also. I am certainly in favor of small business. I am a small business owner. I'm a self-employed small business owner. However, as I look around this community, there are entities out here in our community that make loans. I haven't found any others that pave streets. I haven't found any others that hire police, provide fire. And it is a question of shifting money from one place to another. Eventually, something has to give.
These are unusual times. I think it was a pretty profound statement. These businesses did nothing wrong.
I agree.
They did nothing wrong. They were operating one day, and government is the one that stepped in and shut them down. In a way, they were ordered to close their businesses. Now, they were for health reasons. You know, you can argue that, but they were chugging along. They were doing many of them well, and then bang, they've got there. There's an urgency here, I think. Some people, when you're 90% down in business, it's hard to last another 60 days. And these CDFIs have been helping businesses that aren't in this situation for years and making viable businesses out of them. So I have no personal issues with this at all. I have certain deals with government, but then when I look at government, if we're going to say go to the federal government for funds, don't look to us, I think that makes no sense to me. those dollars are still tax dollars, and I pay a heck of a lot more of those dollars than I do property tax or sales tax, I can assure you. And I would argue the efficiency of getting that money back to here, when it starts up here in Washington and it trickles down through all these organizations, you're worried about $70,000 out of a fund or a buy down. I guarantee you the percentage that gets lost in all of that before it gets to the people that it helps is probably greater. I think the problem we have is we have a business community that's hurting. They're unique businesses. To the extent we can help them with this amount of money that is in that overpass funds, I think it's something that we should consider to do. And again, I would ask, does council have the will to come back with 2 programs, loan programs, from 2 CDFIs, one that will include just to the way they're set up as a way of comparison, a fund, and one that probably won't, so that you can compare the numbers, look at all of the comparisons to see what the overall cost would be, and then be in a position to maybe consider one of those 2 options at a future meeting.
I would like to see 2 CDFIs that don't have a coupled long-term fund on it, so I can do a real comparison of what I think we should do to address the immediate needs.
I too would like to see the CDFI type loan come up to review. The uneasiness, the tension, the confusion. This was all brought on by the haste to get this passed. Had it been brought to us like it was brought tonight with all this explanation, I think we wouldn't be having this haste or this anger or this animosity or the discussion, if, ands, or buts, he said, you said, this is what it is. It was just brought too fast, something real fast. Let's do it with only one option and no other option, which we're in a rush, and we are. Small businesses need a lot of our help, but we need to do it the right way. And frankly, I think $750,000 is about right, but I'd like to see a public private partnership also. I'd like to see a little more, but we need to go the CDA route, and we need to approve something for our small business owners. But I just think a lot of us felt like there was too much confusion without the explanation of what it actually was, and it could have all been avoided had it been brought to us the correct way.
Well, the CDFIs, I believe all of them get a major portion of their funding from grants. That's what put them in business. I think William even mentioned to me when back in the 90s or something when Lift Fund was first originated that Frost donated some money to them. But I think we've got to look at the program and then entice people to come in with more private money in grants. But without showing them a program, I don't know how you're going to go entice people to match something that they don't even understand. And I don't know if there's any other CDFIs to get 2 of them that don't link. I'm only familiar with the 2 that I've looked at.
Yeah, the 2 that I mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, we'll take whatever direction comes from council, and we'll try our best to match that. And if we have to fall short in some of the areas that get discussed, we'll discuss that as well.
How many CDFIs are authorized in Texas? 12?
It was a little over a dozen when I searched, but some of them are geographically based, and so some of them are just some of them are just the city, some of them are just the neighborhood, some of them are just North Texas, some of them, and so the key is finding some that can kind of move around. I would imagine that there might be others. Again, as I alluded to earlier in the presentation, we relied on the insights from SBDC. And the 2 that they mentioned was the primary Lift Fund and then the minor, which was People Fund. And that's the second one that the mayor is alluding to we've exposed him to somewhat from an educational standpoint. But as we go, really briefly, Jeff, if you don't mind, as we go and bring together options, though, it would be helpful for from a timing standpoint to get some maybe clarifying points that maybe go a little bit deeper than just the revolving fund versus not. For example, I think it would be helpful for us to get a sense of the level of importance on the amount. 25, what, and we can have that conversation later, but I guess I'm going to need some information to be able to try and put options together, because without it, I'm going to end up where I was before, right? Which was just thinking what we thought was best, right?
Aren't you saying?
It's what I'm hearing so far. If I can summarize what I'm hearing so far, and just to kind of make sure that I'm hearing correctly, what it sounds like is that the majority of council, if not all, if given the choice between a grant and a loan, prefer the loan. It sounds like, and it sounds like for the council members that side on the side of the loan, that you are open to working with a CDFI.
I think that's the quickest mechanism that we have.
I don't disagree, but
I don't know that there is another option besides a CDFI. Is there?
In my opinion,
RVEDC said they can't support it. Chamber says
Right.
they can't support it.
Well,
in my opinion, no.
They can't manage one. They can't create one.
Can I have a word in there? I haven't had my say yet, okay? Okay.
Saving best for last?
Yes. I spoke with Mike Martinez from the SBA, and he's telling me that they have a lot of experience with the LIFT fund. That's why I think if we go with the LIFT fund and you want to get a comparison, let's do a comparison just on the LIFT fund on the revolving one and then on the one that's the grant. One on the grant and one on the loan. Because all you basically want was the final figures. My question was going to be, if we do the revolving one, who's going to manage that? Are we going to continue having a contract with LIFT fund?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when we were going through those conversations, LIFT Fund would manage that fund, and so they manage similar revolving funds with other communities, but it's a collaborative relationship. And so that was one of the things that was what's the word? I don't know if tricky is the word, but there has to be documentation establishing a relationship, right? But you also don't want to document very specifics that then tie you into those specifics that then anytime that you want to evolve, make it hard to evolve, right? And so the way that they typically approach their relationship with communities is we start off with, I don't want to call it a basic, but sort of a basic model of verbiage in the agreement, but informally and through practice and through experience that they have in other communities, they're constantly working with us on fine-tuning the parameters of that program. So I'm going to make something up. So let's say we had a permanent revolving fund and we go through the downtown master plan, and the downtown master plan, excites everybody back up and suggests that there's the potential to, bring more businesses to downtown. And then the community says, well, you know what? We've got $200,000 in this permanent revolving fund. Can we apply that $200,000 just for downtown? The answer would be yes. We have that level of control without it necessarily having to be outlined in an agreement. And I think that quite honestly, Thomas and I struggled with that too when we were having this conversation with LIFT Fund, because like we're also stewards of tax dollars, right? And so we also look at things from the lens of, is this a worthy investment to the city? And so we also, for a day or two, struggled with the agreement language and this concept that it's a fluid relationship. But at the end of the day, the important factors were in the agreement, right? Which was LIFT Fund's managing, which is the money can only be spent in Victoria, which is that it can accept money from other places, so it creates opportunities. And so it's something new And so that's why there is this feeling of uncomfortable conversation, because it's something new. It hasn't been discussed before. But there are solutions to all these, and there are answers to all these questions. And so if we do go through this exercise and compare one with the other, or proposals or whatever, and if you feel more comfortable, having people in person here, from Live Fund, for example, to engage in the conversation, we can do that. But again, we were trying to kind of proceed in a quick fashion, and again, I'm with you 100%, and that's on me, and council, feel free to hold me accountable how you see fit, for that process. But at the end of the day, we want to help the business community, and it's trying to find a path forward. I'm rambling a little bit now, but
speaking to Mike, he said that they would be able to come down and talk to us. He said, if y'all want me to, he says, I can go to a city council meeting. And because he's got a lot of experience with the Lift Fund, he might be able to answer some questions that we might have that, we haven't thought about.
Right. And in your binder, under the miscellaneous tab at the very end, there's actually a letter by Mark that fairly confident I forwarded that via email, but I included a physical copy in that as well. But again,
Dr. Young put this proper. What's the problem we're trying to solve?
The problem?
What is the problem statement?
So
Are we trying to do COVID-19 help for small businesses? That's what I understood the problem to be. I didn't understand it that we needed to be focused right now at this moment because of such an emergent problem on long-term revolving fund issues.
Right.
The problem statement is, how do we help small businesses with COVID-19 business closures that weren't their own fault? And as such, Lift Fund automatically, in my mind, gets thrown out of the mix because they will not decouple their long-term fund from what we are trying to solve today.
Well, wait a minute. You might be trying to solve that, but I think it's an economic tool. The Dreammaker Fund is another economic tool. We spend money to another entity I won't name. We spend a lot of money to get primary jobs here. We spend the sales tax money there. This is just another tool. I mean, if it's tied to it, fine. It's 3 years down the road. I think it's a great tool. I don't know that you can find somebody. The other fund that was up there, People Fund, they don't do business down here. They do business mainly in Austin. They're out of Fort Worth. There's a fund out of New Mexico. That's your three choices. Okay, Lift Fund does things here, but I think the Dreammaker Fund is a great thing. It's a great thing for downtown. It's 3 years down the road. It's a tool that, if it had been brought up without the COVID thing, I would have supported it hands down. I think it's a great thing. Now we have two things here we could do that are good for small business. Now we can sit here and talk about some other thing, but it's going to go. What are you going to do? I think it's a great fund. That's why I voted for it to begin with.
Has nothing to do with the emergency we have right now.
Yes, it does. The first money is for the emergency.
That part of the program does not have anything to do with COVID-19.
Do we even know what the interest rate is on that?
On what?
0 for us.
No. The long term, the Dream Makers Fund, they make interest off that money in the long term.
Yes, and they've been very successful at it.
Do we know what the interest rate is, Mark?
It depends on the size of the loan.
Look, this is an uncomfortable
I would not
question.
take out a loan without knowing the interest rate. So you're going to vote to say that this is a great thing and not even know the parameters.
I know, compared to other ones, that they've been very successful with it. I know that Corpus wants to invest $4 million in it. I know that there's a city called Canton. Do anybody know where Canton is? It's 5,000 population. They have $500,000. Now, either we do something for small business or we let them burn.
This is the uncomfortable question. my heart bleeds for small business too, but where is it written that the Victoria City Council has the obligation for the city of Victoria to solve this problem? This is a community problem, and I think that we can be a partner in it, but where is it written that this is our responsibility? And we've had a vote on this, and we voted it down once.
Where is it
We're
written?
having a work session.
Where's it written we can't?
It's not.
Other cities go to the help of their people. We do support businesses in many ways all the time. So I don't know, I don't understand the hang up in us taking the lead in helping our businesses at a time like this.
The difficulty with this work session is that if we express an opinion, other people have other opinions. It's good to voice them, but this isn't I make a statement, somebody else tells me why it's wrong. Someone else makes a statement, someone tells them why they're wrong. We can be here for a long time.
Back to what I was going at. Does anybody have any issues with bringing back two proposals? Now, you could, and the only reason I do kind of mention the lift fund because the upfront zero interest is there throughout the loan. From my understanding of the other one, the other one is not. I just want you to know the people fund is a different fund, but its interest is only for a few months. I just want to have two things where we can compare numbers with, and you can vote it for or against at the next meeting.
Well, you've already got my vote on lift fund.
All right, so there's.
Well, we're not even taking a
want
vote
to
now.
decouple.
I would like to see it decoupled as well. I would like to see if they would come with that. And then even looking at the parameters that they put behind it, I'd like to possibly change some of those.
Well, the one
And I don't know
thing
if those are their parameters or there's things that we can do.
Well, the one thing
I
about
mean, they had a 15% loss. I'd like to see a 25% loss. I believe it was what their
Right, yeah. In
lift
terms
fund's
of
parameters.
impact related to
Sure,
COVID, right?
sure. And can we have businesses, I wrote it down, undergo some kind of training or evaluation to maximize their potential and identify deficiencies and inefficiencies with the SBDC?
That's what they do.
I know, but what if you get this loan and you don't do this? SBDC is not necessarily tied to this thing. Can we tie those two and marry those two that these businesses?
Like get them to commit to coach.
Correct.
Type counsel,
Yeah,
advise, et cetera.
absolutely.
And attend.
Correct. I mean, if we're going to give this money, I want them to be successful. And if they're missing some steps in their business to be successful, well, can we help them?
I understand that's what Mike does. You know,
Correct.
together with
if they go through them, this isn't necessarily through them. I didn't understand.
I think what Dr. Young's is alluding to is us finding a way to get a commitment formally that the recipients of the loan would work through the SBDC for counseling and advisement, as opposed to it maybe be optional.
Yeah, because the services.
I don't think he's saying that SBDC doesn't do that.
No,
yeah,
SBDC offers free counseling, so
Right, yeah.
our tax dollars are already paying for that.
But you don't have to do that in order to get a loan from Lift Fund in the outside world. And he's trying to make our program have that be a requirement.
I think, I'm not sure, but it sounded like that's what Mike was said, but I'm not for sure. But he said he would come down here and talk to us. That way we have clarification on that. I know everybody thinks that we need to have counseling because that's why, in order to help these people to make sure that they're successful, we don't want them to fail.
Of course.
We want to help them. So, as much counseling, as much help. I mean, the money's not going to help by itself. They need some counseling, let's give it to them. It's free.
Incentivize it and say at the end of the loan, if you've gone through your required counseling, it will be a zero interest loan. If not, you owe the interest. And it goes back into the fund, not to Lift Fund, because we've already paid down the interest.
Do we know how many businesses in the city limits that this could potentially affect? Is there a number less than 1 million?
No, unfortunately, it's very difficult to try and extrapolate that. I mean, some of the questions that I received or that circulated in was also trying to get a sense of, well, how many businesses were awarded the PPP, how many businesses maybe didn't get accepted for whatever reason,
Sure.
or who's in the queue for the other program.
I'm curious. This
You know,
is for
it's-
Mr. Rainier.
I'm
Could
not-
you do a database query search of the sales tax filings for City of Victoria businesses and total tax sales of the last 12 months under $1 million?
For sales tax, absolutely, yeah.
I can do that, but I
Well,
can't.
when you remit your sales tax form,
Yeah, but
there's total sales in there.
But going into it,
You would know how many businesses.
We weren't looking at it as only applicable to a business that pays sales tax.
Any business is in trouble.
And so if the direction from council is to focus on just businesses that produce sales tax, well, then absolutely we could look at that data. But there are some types of businesses that don't charge sales tax. Like not every haircut place, for example.
Where's the money coming from?
What do you mean? Yeah, you mean to put that parameter? Yeah. And that's
I would like to see it as
well, and that's
parameter.
why I mentioned earlier that if that's a parameter that council wants to see, we can do that, and we can certainly try and extrapolate what you just suggest in terms of sales tax.
If you're looking at, Mr. Mayor, proposals, all I can tell you is that I don't want to see it coupled with the Dream Maker Fund or any type of fund like that. I want to take care of immediate needs. So I would just have to look at the people fund.
Well, if we look at the people fund, I mean, the thing about these CDFIs, what I'm afraid of, they have been loaning to these types of businesses for a long time. They know the parameters about them. They know, honestly, more than we know about them in many ways. So if we start putting too many restrictions on them, they may not be able to function within the way they do it because they go out and seek grant money to help fund their deal. So I'm a little hesitant because if they're going to be here, for any length of time, they have to figure out a way to take that grant money and maximize it, help the business, and stay in business themselves. I mean, they have to function to do it. So I would rather just see what kind of deal they could bring decoupled from a deal for us to analyze. You can mention some of the things we have concerns with and see what their responses are.
How about a grant program then that's just $104,000, which is what Lyft would make off of the whole program? You got it on there too. I mean, that's the money that we've lost already. We know of.
5,000 at 21. It's
Yeah, but you're
105,000.
dismissing the fact that they would go out and get grants to increase the fund. And that's the only way they can perpetuate themselves.
But we're just doing. I just want a 2 to 3 year program until everything's paid back for COVID-19. That's all I'm interested in.
Well, we'd have to see what they do because I think of course, those were larger loans. They were up to
One-time loan,
5.
too.
Yeah.
One-time loaning of money, not continually loaning for COVID-19. It's one time, funds are gone, that's it.
Well, if we were concerned and we were going to save 27 jobs, I believe is they had to retain or
Yes.
keep, a $5,000 loan or grant would be $135,000. I mean, that's why I asked how many businesses. You could affect 27 businesses, which is essentially that, and it would be loan free. It would be a grant.
Well, then if
And
we
you
want to
take
look at
take 135 off 750, and you got $615,000 left. You only affect 27 businesses, but it seems to be that was what we were going to do, and these would get it, and they'd be free and clear.
Well, if we want to look at a grant program, then we have 2 local entities that would get with the city and help determine
just-
the parameters of a grant.
I'm throwing stuff against the wall and see what sticks.
It's the same money we were going to spend with the lift fund.
And that could, that, and,
That we've never seen back.
but that money could get out there
That's interesting.
immediately.
Well, and I think with these other funds, they can go into action pretty fast once they have the money, because they have programs that they are experienced in. So,
I'd
is
be
it
okay with the $135,000 grant, maximum $5,000.
Has anybody heard that Yorktown's giving everybody $25 gift cards to go and just eat at a local restaurant? Maybe we can just give everybody $100 or $1,000.
save business?
We don't have to worry about the lift fund or anybody.
I propose that if, from an emergent standpoint and immediacy, and that gives us 615 left of that 750, and then we can determine.
Well,
The
perhaps you
the
set up-
long-term fund.
If the
That
appetite
would
is
be
more for a
decoupling.
grant program, maybe you start a grant program, and then we have the option to fund it as we wish with the partners we create.
What would your
Put up
criteria be?
200,000, and if there's a true need out there and we see it, actually put
135.
Another-
What would your
Well,
criteria
that was,
be?
that just hit the 27, which was talked about before. We'd
Can
still
I-
have to have some criteria that they'd have to be in business from a certain time period. I would say loss of income. I would have to do some more homework in that regard, but I'm open
Yeah.
to any suggestions. But
Can I
that's-
make a suggestion? So if the direction from council is to explore a grant program, I would request to just give us an opportunity to put something together that's more, for discussion, that's based off of, maybe what the criteria is in other communities, and it's just a thought.
Thank you. I was way out of my expertise in that regard, so I appreciate the lifeline.
I mean, and one of the beauties, right, about the fact that other communities have done this before us, right, is that we can look at what their applications look like, right, what some of their criteria look like, and kind of tailor those to, whatever council would like. I would simply throw back out the question, though, about that went into the original reflection, which is, and I think the way that Councilman Bognight worded it, I think was fair, was, what's the problem statement, right? And so if the problem statement is strictly to assist businesses get through this COVID episode, right? I get it. Throws off the long-term revolving fund, right? I get that. But then we got to ask ourselves, well, what is more likely to actually do that, right? What is more likely to actually help? If the problem statement is helping a business through COVID-19, what's more likely going to do that? A $5,000 grant or a loan up to $25,000? And so it's just another, right? Because what we don't want to do, right, is simply just hand out grants that might still lead to that business, shutting down 2 months from now. Right. And I'm not suggesting that that's going to happen. Obviously, there's a lot of communities that are doing $5,000 grants. So it helps. I'm not trying to suggest that it doesn't. But it's just another point of consideration.
Let me put this out for consideration. Would it be too difficult to go bring back a loan deal from people to see what it looks like? And in that same time period that you put together a grant program that the city would manage with its partners,
sure,
the partners that you would like to do, then we bring back those two options.
Can Lyft
with
decouple
facts
the
and numbers, and then we decide.
Is doing nothing a third option?
Well,
I mean, I feel
What
like
is-
we're
what
getting
is
backed
council's-
into now it's either this one or this one. You wanted a choice, now you've got a choice.
Well, it's council's general deal to do nothing.
No, we need to do something.
I want to turn over every stone to see that if there's some way to help small businesses while not jeopardizing the other 67,000 taxpayers' funds to help those 27, 34, whatever it is.
Jeopardizing?
Huh?
Jeopardizing? What do you mean by that? Could you clarify what you mean by that?
Because I have taxpayer funds that we're doing this with. And there's a risk inherent with loaning that stuff out to underbanked businesses, for lack of a better term. There's a risk of loss, and we're going to have to be accepting of some loss if we do it. But what's acceptable and trying to balance the needs of the small businesses and really micro businesses, right, versus being a steward of taxpayer dollars that everybody else has contributed to.
So once again, what about bringing back
And so,
a
yes,
loan program?
to answer Mrs. Scott,
And
yes,
you can
doing
vote
nothing is
to
an
do-
option.
And then when you vote to neither accept neither one of them, then that no is an option.
I'd say yes, no is an option because there may not be anything that's palatable. To me, it sounds like Lift Fund keeps trying to be brought back up. But we had a definitive vote on it, and what I heard, one of the major bones of contention on it was the Dreammaker Fund, and I'm hearing that that's not going to change.
My goal tonight was to come up with a solution, a way to move forward. I don't have a dog in this hunt one way or the other. My concern, and I don't mind saying it, I've said it before, I want to help our businesses. I think that we do have an obligation to help in this circumstance. This is an unusual circumstance. Many of these businesses find themselves in these positions through no fault of their own. So could we come to an agreement to bring back a CDFI loan program that's decoupled from a permanent fund, to see what's out there to that, and then at the same time, we've already got commitments, I think, and correct me if I'm right, Mr. Garza, from the VDC and perhaps the chamber to work with you to help you and determine factors for for grants.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And I forgot to mention earlier that both Dale and Jeff are here. I don't know if they're still here behind me, but
Is that correct?
But
I think that's what I
they're
understood
here
the letter.
too to help address any questions you might have.
And
it hasn't in other communities. It appears to be that a lot of these grant programs are sort of committee type of approach, if you want to call it that, on the management of it.
I would suggest, though, that if you're going to have a committee like that, that you take someone from BEDC, maybe the chamber, however they partner up, have a council member on there and a Sales Tax Development Corporation member. Staff can
Could it be a
provide
council?
some
Could it be a
guidance,
council
but I
member
don't
that's
think
on
that,
VSTDC?
That's fine. But I don't think that it should be upon staff to make those decisions on where this money goes. I don't think that's fair.
So recommendation
Is
Got
that, I don't think that's fair.
We
for
could
staff.
structure the grant option that
But
way.
couldn't you do it like you do the hot funds?
Yeah, where the recommendation comes to council for
it
final
comes to
approval. Yeah,
council, we
and
would
and
be
there
the
have been other communities that have established processes that ultimately make council the deciding deciding entity or group. So that is being done in other communities that way. Not all, but it's out there.
Is that a palatable?
3 options, right?
moving forward? Yeah, the option of doing nothing is always there.
Yep.
It's kind of like you voted down. But
like to just
I
make a
just feel
statement.
like we've learned a lot in the discussion. Yes, it's an uneasy feeling because we've never been faced with anything like this. But I can tell you, I've been sequestered in a basement for several months, dealing with things that I thought I would never have to contemplate. So we're in strange times, is all I can tell you. So is that
In my opinion, no shouldn't be an option. I understand it is. But in my opinion, no shouldn't be an option.
we're going to
We
bring
ought do
back
something,
two
either a grant or loan program.
We're going to bring back 2 choices
I
to
understand
look at. Do you think
everyone's
it could be by the next scheduled meeting?
But we have to be a good steward of taxpayers' money. but we also have to support our small businesses in some shape, form, or fashion. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, my goal would be to, if council's up to it, to call a special meeting to discuss it. I think at the end of the day, there is a certain level of urgency, and we need to kind of balance that urgency with the thorough process that Councilmember Bachnight is suggesting. And so if council's open to having a special meeting, maybe as early next week, as an example.
Tried to schedule one for
Don't
March
tell me
12th.
7 days.
Come on.
Yeah.
7 days.
Yeah, there you go.
I tried already.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. Is that a path forward?
I would prefer to. Yeah, I'm always going to side with moving quickly. It's just how I'm wired. So best case scenario, we call a special meeting. Worst case scenario, we can do it at the next council meeting.
If you're ready before then you get me a deal.
Sure, I'll let you know.
I'll call a special meeting.
Yeah,
We'll be here.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for the spirited discussion.
And thank.
I know that it's difficult, but I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, regardless of whether this leads to a project or not, this is setting a good foundation for us to have more conversations about how to be involved with economic development. It's opening the doors for us to have more formalized conversations, relationships with the chamber, with VEDC, with VSTDC, and in my opinion, all good things can only come from that. So thank you all for your willingness to talk about it.
I'd like to say one thing. Yes, I feel passionate about my opinions. In all the presentations, I've been very impressed with Lift Fund, with the concept of Lift Fund and what they do. And I want to encourage people to make donations. Maybe wait until we decide if we're going to have our own grant program. But I just want to make it clear that even though I had a lot of questions, from what I've read about them, I'm impressed with that company. Thank you.
Well, if they're willing to decouple, ask them.
Trust me, we tried. Anyway, okay, I think we got our marching orders, so thank you.
And once again, council members, thank you so much for being willing to spend the time to talk through these tough issues. I appreciate it very much, and I respect each and every one of you.
And us you.
We still have city managers' reports that we need to get back to.
Meeting to do.
So we have several city managers' reports on there. The CAP discussion, I think it's best to table to another meeting, whether it's the special meeting or the next regular council meeting. I've already pushed out the library once. I don't want to push out the library again. And we do have our financial report. And so I'd like for the financial report to be presented next, and hopefully that's not too long. And then we'll end the night with the update from the library, and then that'll be it for tonight.
So we won't do the.
So I'll call up. I'm sorry?
So you said we won't do the capital improvements?
Correct. We'll push that one out. And so Wesley will kick off this item.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Tonight we'll be presenting the audit of the city's financial statements for our fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019. Harrison Waldrop and Herrick performed our audit and assisted in the preparation of our annual report, which has been posted to the website and distributed to the appropriate agencies. We have Steve Van Manen here from HWU, who's going to give an overview of the report and some financial highlights. So I'll turn it over to him.
Well, the information that we're going to go over tonight is going to be a little redundant. I mean, we've had a lot of information floated out here, so pardon me. I had a presentation, a very lengthy presentation planned. I've since revised that as we've gone through this process, but you should have a copy in electronic form of this report on your laptops. Unfortunately, some of the page numbers that we have in this document and on your file don't match, but I'll try and direct you to the correct location. The report is broken down into 4 separate sections: the introduction section, financial section, there's a statistical section, and the last section is what's called the single audit section. Now, the introductory section basically is a letter from the administration to the mayor and council. It talks about some of the financial projects that were completed last year, the local economy, future initiatives, et cetera. Following the introductory section, the financial section starts with the auditor's opinion. And from, it's a letter found in our firm's letterhead, and this is what's called a unmodified or a clean opinion. It's on the second page, top paragraph, where it says, in our opinion, these financial statements are presented fairly in all material respects. Now, from a CPA's perspective, I can't give council any greater assurance than this form of opinion that these financial statements are accurate. The next section is called the Management's Discussion and Analysis, and that starts on page 4. Now, the MD&A purpose is to provide the users of these financial statements a very quick way to assess the financial activity for what happened in 2019. Now, besides City Council, the primary users of this document are going to be your bond rating agencies. And they really like this section of the report because they can very quickly assess whether or not the financial condition of the city improved or declined from the prior fiscal year. Starting on page 4, there's some budgetary or some financial highlights. One of the things that was discussed earlier was the general fund balance. You know, it's at 39%. This is as of September 30th, 2019. But it was at 39% of your annual operating expenses. And minimum fund balance policy sets that at 25%. So there is a 14% excess or increase or over the minimum fund balance, which equates as of 9/30/19 to about $6 million. Now, the answer to the question of whether the financial condition improved or declined is found on page 9. On page 9, there's a financial statement titled Change in Net Position. The third row from the bottom, titled Change in Net Position. Now, this is broken down between the governmental activities and business type. Governmental being the general fund, your special revenue funds, the debt service fund, and your capital projects. And the business type, this is your utility fund, environmental services, community center, et cetera. But third row from the bottom, if that number is a positive number, that indicates that the financial condition improved over the prior fiscal year. So you can see under the governmental activities, there was a positive or an increase in the net position of $17 million. A big part of that was the TxDOT overpass money that the city received back in September. And that's a one-time thing. But again, that shows a significant improvement in the financial condition over the prior year. Under the business type, we have an increase of $4.5 million. Again, another good increase in the net position. So citywide, we had an increase of $21,839,000 in the net position. Very substantial. I'm going to flip over a few pages and look at the general fund income statement, page 28. Okay, there we go. On page 28, the general fund, in the left-hand column. Now, for the year, again, back to the third row from the bottom, there's a slight decrease in the fund balance from the prior fiscal year, a decrease of $690,000. That represents about a 3% decrease, but you can still see the total fund balance is a little over $20 million. Now, that $20 million is comprised of 3 different parts. We have what's called non-spendable fund balance of $454,000, committed fund balance of $883,000, and then unassigned fund balance of $18,849,000. So it did have a slight decrease, but overall is still in excellent financial condition. Back on page 28 and 29.
Steve?
Yes.
Just over here.
Oh.
I'm behind this glass. I just want to make sure that the number that Jesus was mentioning earlier, that $19 million, right. If you can explain how that number is developed.
Yeah, the $19 million that was discussed earlier, that's a combination on page 25 of the committed and unassigned. You add those two together, that's that $19 million plus. Now, I did want to point out on page 29, there's a column titled the Capital Construction. It says Fund 3036. Now, under the intergovernmental line, that $11,421,000, that was the payment received from TxDOT this past year. And you see in that fund, there were no expenditures for that current year, so the fund balance grew after taking into consideration some operating transfers by a little over $10 million. The business type financials start on page 31 and 32. This is the assets and liabilities. Now, in the conversations that were had earlier also, we were talking about the business type working capital. You know, in the general fund, your working capital is your fund balance. Now, there's a different set of accounting rules when you're dealing with business type, so there's not a single number here that will agree back. There's not a fund balance number on the business type activities. But if you take your current assets minus your current liabilities, you basically get to what your current working capital number is. There are also financial statements in this document pertaining to the Sales Tax Development Corporation. It's on page 41. And on the left-hand column, this is the STDC, again, numbers as of 9/30 of 2019. And their fund balance, unrestricted fund balance, was a little over $16 million. Starting on page 44, there's a section titled The Notes to the Financial Statements, and the purpose of the notes is just to provide additional information related to the financial statements. Now, you'll see the further you go back and report, the more detailed the information is. You know, it's kind of built like a pyramid. We're starting at the top on the front of the report, and you'll get into the individual combining funds. So the further you go back, the more information you get. Page 90. This is the budget comparison for the general fund. And presented on this page, on the left-hand column, you know, the council adopts a budget prior to the beginning of the fiscal year, and that's represented in the original budget column. Now, as the year progresses, there are changes that are made, and the final amended budget is presented in that second column, actual, and then the variance, positive and negative, with the comparison for the prior year actual. So looking at the third row from the bottom, the original budget anticipated a deficit of $4,651,000. The amended budget anticipated a deficit of $5,888,000, and the actual results of operation was a deficit of $690,000 for really a favorable variance of about $5.2 million from what the anticipated ending fund balance from B to what actual fund balance was. Starting on page 102, these are where you get into the detail, the individual funds, and these funds run through 102 to 203, page 203. Following that, the statistical section. Now, this gives you 10 years worth of history on various financial trends of the city. I mean, you can look at what sales tax was 10 years ago, ad valorem taxes, hotel motel taxes, what it was 10 years ago and today. And you'll see the trends, you know, the downturn it took during the 08-09 recession. Been good information, especially when you'll start talking about, you know, budgetary issues. History is always a good place to start. The single audit section and the final section of the report. Now, the single audit section is here because the city receives in excess of $750,000 annually in federal aid. And once you exceed that threshold, there are certain other tests and procedures that we have to perform, namely just test of internal controls over the administration of the federal programs and also compliance with the specific rules related to how these federal program monies can be spent. And so the results of both of those reports was that there were no issues of material weaknesses that were noted, nor were there any instances of noncompliance noted with any of the federal programs tested. I sure hope you have some questions. And if you don't tonight, I'd certainly be happy to come back at a future council meeting and attempt to answer them. Or certainly feel free to call if you have a question.
Steve, I got a comment real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It's to address a couple of comments you made during the presentation. I apologize. There's a lot of information, and I usually do that stuff, so bear with me. I just want to point out something that's clear that I know when you go look at this, and review that, you're going to see, like Steve mentioned, there's a deficit, drawdown. Well, just keep one thing in mind when you look at that. It's going to show a drawdown. But keep in mind that when you have those drawdowns, they were planned drawdowns because we budget sometimes to draw down because of one-time expenditures. That's going to bring your working capital fund balance down. So it's not a bad thing. It's a planned thing. Now, Thomas, for being a lawyer, brought up a very, very nice topic that, we don't deficit budget it, so I was make sure you understand we're not just drawing down money like crazy. They're planned deficits, but they're not like going out of whack because we do have policy and guidelines, a minimum fund balance, making sure we got recurring revenues matching recurring expenses, and then the little excess like Jesus and everybody's been talking about, that one-time money is when you try to use and capitalize on those one-time expenditures. I was make sure we're okay.
I just want to state for the record, it was not my intention to draw out this meeting any longer.
Absolutely
than
not.
it already is.
Kudos to Thomas.
I'm looking to breakfast now.
So Gilbert, are you talking about that $1.3 million that you drew down from the 11 million that we got from the state?
You mean the textile overpass money?
Yeah, the textile fund.
Well, that's one-time money coming in, but we're drawing that down.
Yeah, I know you did, but there was a $1.3 million drawdown on that.
Yeah, that was a plan. That's for actual payments on debt and everything else.
Yeah.
And then when you see next year, you're going to see about $3 or $4 million because we paid off all the bonds. Remember that? We defeased all the bonds. That was $3-point-something million. So that's gone.
Okay.
So we paid a 20-year bond and within 10 years. So, yes, you're going to see a draw. Those are planned drawdowns. Like construction funds, if you got a construction that just keeps increasing, we got some issues. We're not spending the money then. Anyway.
I have a question on that fund also, just in the way you presented it. I'm not sure I understood you correctly. Talking about the TxDOT fund, you said that it had just come in, there hadn't been any expenses on it, and then I thought you said it had grown by 10 million.
The actual fund balance, the
$11
million that was received is an increase in the fund balance.
But
and then there was an expenditure for the transfer out for an amount of money, resulting in a $10 million increase in the fund balance from the beginning of the year.
Because the fund started at zero.
Correct.
It's not that it made $10 million.
Well, it did. It did. That it was a profit.
Okay. But it didn't earn $10 million.
Well, you had 11 million in revenue.
Okay, 11 million in revenue.
And you spent $1 million.
Right. I understand.
Okay.
It just, to a layperson, it didn't sound
well,
the same.
And that's what Gilbert was saying. The nature of a capital project fund is that in the year that you receive the money, your fund balance goes way up. And from that point forward, all you have are deficits because you're not getting any more revenue. All you're doing is spending the bond proceeds, or in this case, you're spending the TxDOT proceeds. So in the initial year, you have an increase in fund balance. From thereafter, fund balance goes down. Folks, I sure appreciate the assistance of working with the staff here is great. They do a tremendous amount of work involved in preparing this document. I mean, y'all go through a lot of extra effort to prepare what's called a comprehensive annual financial report versus what you're required to present. And the city has received an award for this document, I think, for the last 36 years in a row. So, I mean, it's a really impressive document. I certainly encourage y'all to review it. And again, if y'all have some questions that would come up after tonight, I'd be, pleased to certainly come back at a future council meeting and discuss. Anyway, thank y'all very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, we have one more report tonight, the Victoria Public Library's annual report.
Good evening, Council. This evening, I'm going to give you updates on 3 different things. First of all, a report on the state of the library during 2019, the library's response to COVID-19, and then finally, I'm going to finish up with an update on our reflooring project. Just to go over accomplishments from 2019, During that year, we had our first library amnesty event, which was a success. I reported on this back last February, but just to remind you quickly, we had, during that amnesty, 740 library users who cleared their accounts of fines, 363 lost items were returned or paid for, and 808 library accounts were either updated or created for new users. We also focused on growing our adult programming and improving the content of that programming, redesigning our teen services to reach that age group, and refocused on teaching benchmark skills established by our schools to ensure our preschoolers and our younger children attending our programs were exposed to those basic skills before they entered into kindergarten. We also continued to grow and develop our digital services provided through our website. And the newest addition to our digital collections is a product that's called Flipster. That provides access to a variety of new magazines and the back issues. Mainly popular magazines is what we focus on. So if you are a Victoria County cardholder, you can access those magazines through our website. Lastly, we completed one building project, which was reflooring of our first floor office area in 2019. So by the numbers, these are the 2019 numbers. We had a fairly comparable year to the previous year. In 2019, we moved out of that Hurricane Harvey recovery mode. It felt like that we were in for quite some time. We settled into a time of stable and growing use of our collections and attendance at our programs. So we currently have 43,000 cardholders. We offer about 550 programs annually. And of course, our most popular programs are children and family events. We also are a site for internet access with over 57,000 uses in our building and 14,000 uses of our Wi-Fi. So one interesting area that I wanted to make you aware of is the long-term change occurring in the use of our physical items versus our digital items. Just found this interesting. When we look back over the last 5 years, this graph shows that breakdown with physical items being in blue and our digital items in orange. So over that 5-year period, we started in 2015 where we checked out a little over 20,000 digital items that year. That was about 5% of total circulations. In 2019, digital circulation had increased and use of our physical items has decreased. Use of digital items is now about 7.5% of total circulations. So this points to that slow but steady growth in the use of our digital collections and the decline, but also the volatility I'm seeing of usage of our physical collections, which is also influenced, of course, by things such as hurricanes and pandemics. So we're going to see quite a change here when we look back at 2020.
That graph, back up one.
Yeah, sure.
The second to the last column, the physical items, 327.
Yes.
And then 340 on the next one, and yet
Yes.
the 340 is lower than the 327.
Because it's a stacked, I think, because our 28,000 is, well, you're right.
Percentage. It's percentages.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just the blue represents the percentage that 340 of the total.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Bachnight. I appreciate that. All right.
Am I seeing that right, though? Because 28,000 is smaller.
Yeah. It was, like I said, 7.5% was the total circulations in
show down to 0.
2019, and it was like 5% in 2015.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're not seeing the rest of the blue either.
All right, so goals for 2020, already almost, halfway through this year. Building updates, new carpet and floor layout, and new water fountains. We've almost accomplished all of that. We are looking forward with developing that partnership with Main Street and the idea of the public library as an economic impact source. Our partnership with VISD, we're continuing to work on developing some kind of agreement with them so we can provide student access to our digital book collection. We also are going to be involved in the conversations with council as those proceed about the expansion of library services and what that looks like throughout the service area. And I'm really excited about what's going to be happening this summer after July 1. We've applied and received funding for federal reimbursement for our internet access and also some replacement of our aging equipment. So we will hopefully have a new internet provider with faster internet speeds beginning in July. And then our staff has been trained, and we continue to support, of course, the Census 2020 by helping those individuals who want to use library computers, hopefully once we reopen, to get them ready to fill out the census.
I know I'm going to get questions if anybody's still watching. You said you're getting a new internet service provider at the library?
Yes, we are. And this is through the program called E-Rate.
Any chance that they can offer services throughout the city?
I can certainly ask them and see if they have any interest.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
So I want to move on now to the library's COVID-19 response. We shut the physical building March 23rd. We started a curbside service for pickup of library materials. We also continued having phone and email service, and we moved our programming to Facebook Live and then Zoom virtual programming. We'd been averaging about 200 cars weekly through our service drive for pickup. We've had about 100 calls daily on our phones. And our biggest growth was with our digital programming. Our first online story time that we presented on Facebook Live, we had 961 views in a 24-hour period. So that was quite like a wow. That was a big jump for us. We're also doing weekly trivia for adults, and that fills up quickly. That's on Zoom. And we've made it easier to get a library card by phone so that you can access our digital resources. We hope that we can continue that through our website in the future. We're going to develop a form where you can fill out online for your card and pick it up within 60 days. Our website use has been very comparable to use when we were open regular hours, and our Wi-Fi usage has been a bit lower than I thought it would be. But just this week, the equipment that sends that Wi-Fi signal out through our building, it was moved, so now a larger portion of our parking lot that's attached right there to our building has Wi-Fi accessibility, and we're going to be telling the public about that as well. So that's available. So just to give you some cumulative statistics on use of services between March 23rd and May 1st, when our building's been closed to the public, we had about 1,100 cars come through our service desk. This is updated to what you're probably looking at on your own screen because I've updated the numbers. And we've had over 17,000 physical items checked out, 4,600 digital items. 12,000 people have viewed or participated in our online programs, and we've answered 1,800 phone calls and emails, and 426 uses of our Wi-Fi. And just to show you a little bit more detail on that, when you compare that usage during the COVID-19 response to an average weekly usage in 2019, you can see what's happening here. Physical items, the checkouts have gone way down. So we're doing about 2,980 a week versus usually we're doing 7,000 a week when our physical building is open. Digital items have gone up. So we're doing over 700 versus almost 585. Phone calls increased, program attendance jumped dramatically, and our Wi-Fi hasn't been used as well as I hoped it would be and thought it would be. But we're going to try to see what we can do to improve that here. Now, to the last piece of my report tonight, the library reflooring project. We started that on March the 30th. We had demolition, shelving, and materials were moved that week. And by the week of April 13th, new carpet was starting to be installed. Our rubber flooring was installed the week of April 20th. And this last week, all the flooring was completed and the furniture and shelves were reset on the floor. So our final walkthrough is scheduled for this week, and we have some final cleanup to do. The new flooring looks really, really nice, and the new layout, I think, has created some nice seating areas and better flow of how materials are organized. So I'm real excited to get it open and let the public see how nice it looks. Quite a difference. And those pictures are the old carpet that you're looking at.
What great timing, though.
I know. It really worked
Gonna look
out.
for silver linings.
Yeah. So just to recap my report, we had a brief return in 2019 to regular flow and growth pattern for our services. We have a slow shift toward use of digital materials. Library staff have developed new ways to stay connected to the community during COVID-19. And our reflooring project is almost complete, except for that final walkthrough. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor and Council, Mr. Garza had to step out, but one of the things I know that he would want me to acknowledge is that Dana and her staff and the staff that she leads have done a fantastic job from our perspective, not only in increasing and maintaining service levels during all of COVID. You mentioned she mentioned that she's got a new internet service provider. Dana proactively found a service or a program that would pay 80% of the cost of that service. At Christmas time, so even before all of this, they did a program for gingerbread houses with more than 1,200 participants at the community center. This is a staff that outreaches and is a bright, shining light in what we do as a city. And so I thank Dana for what she does, and I know that's a sentiment I pass on from Mr. Garza. So.
I echo those remarks. Thank you very much. While we're thanking people, Derek, you and Mike, I want to point out all the work that y'all have done in this COVID crisis as liaison groups to all of our nonprofits and stuff that we've tried to partner with to get things done and services to people. They played a vital role in this deal, and I thank you both for that.
Thank you, sir.
I think, are we at the end of our agenda?
We can go another hour. Come on.
I don't think we need, I'm not taking a vote on whether we're done.